Good morning on September 11th, an anniversary of sorts, like every day is, but this one certainly comes with ideas about how capable we are as humans to destroy things in the name of what's right, when destruction is never right. It's an expression of wrong. In nature, when things are seemingly destroyed, they tend to lead to better things, always. They tend to provide a way for things to grow and develop. And when we are destructive, mentally, internally, as a species, we come up with sick alternatives to thinking nature has any basis in our state of mind and being. And Gabe and Anthony are here today so far from last week. And a couple of the points that I wanted to make with them, Anthony had some question about truth being true and can you prove it and all that. My experiences, as has been the case with many people I have dealt with over the years, talked to, shared these concepts and ideas with, is that if a truth, present nature, if truth, reality weren't real or true, our present awareness wouldn't so keenly, thinking awareness wouldn't so keenly be clear about what's wrong, wouldn't see things wrong so clearly. And while we may be twisted in the thinking we're doing about the wrong we're seeing, which is very often the case, it's still an indication that we're absolutely capable of recognizing what is wrong as something distinct from what we know is right. And what would be right is something within our human experience. What would be right in reality and truth is that reality is real and truth is true. Simple, straightforward, no contest there. We can create a contest, but to say blue is blue sort of assures thinking that blue is blue. Now, maybe there's shades of blue that aren't quite blue that can be argued, and all of it can be twisted into forms of the light spectrum is infinitesimally capable of expressing different versions of that. But if you're talking about something, like if you let something be what it is, if you allow it to be what it is, you begin to see that it is what it is, regardless of whether we allow it. And last week, we talked about acceptance. And the big issue there, the overarching issue, is that things don't need us to accept them to be. But when we begin to accept how they are, we begin to see that what we think of them isn't necessarily what they are, that they are what they are without our thinking. And so in one respect, it seems to diminish thinking as being something critical, but in fact, it actually allows it the freedom to begin to think constructively rather than destructively about things. Because we begin to have a relationship built on peace rather than an idea that somehow is opposing what they are, and now they need to live up to the expectations I have as a result of the demands I've placed on them, and I wonder why I'm in conflict with all things. And inner turmoil and anxiety is good evidence, especially today where we've got so many anxiety disorders and a growing list, and addiction is at an all-time high, and suicide's at an all-time high, and homicide is in many cities at an all-time high, are good indications that the social ills, the social dysfunction, is a broad dysfunction of the individual thinking that we're all doing. And so a couple of the points last week, aside from the one just pointed to with Anthony, was his idea, the sort of seeming idea of how do you prove truth is true and reality is reality? Well, I would say the easiness that comes with the surrender or concession to the idea that they're true regardless of what we think puts thinking in proper order as something we do rather than who we are. And when I begin thinking my thoughts are real and true, I begin thinking who I am is what my thoughts are, and all I am is what I think. So I need to chronically think about myself to try to perfect that self I think I am, because I think the lie that I'm maintaining can be true. And as a result, I've empowered it with my own ability to make believe lies are true. And that's conflict right there. That's anxiety. My anxiety is an accurate assessment of something I'm doing that's causing me harm or potential to cause me and others harm. Because the thought is harmful, it's going to be expressed in harmful ways all the time. So nature itself doesn't do that. Nature interacts. This thing we're talking about is interreaction, because the basis of my own thinking is reactive. So I react to the reaction, to the reaction, to the reaction, and I live in a constant state of fear, thinking my thought is basically my life, and my thinking, my life depends on my thinking, and all of a sudden anyone who doesn't think like me becomes a threat, and I can't work with them, and I can't be productive with them. And so what do I become? Useless in my own thinking and useless to the society I am a part of. I become a thorn, a weight, a lag, a drag, something that just gets pulled along because I have no freedom in that thinking. I have freedom as a being, as a knowing, present awareness. I have that freedom, but I'm not expressing it in that thinking. So on the principled state that we approached last week, and also in principles in general, principles always define how things work. They're always the premise for how all things work, not some things. So if truth and reality are true and real, then all things possible are a function of, a product of, a byproduct of, subsequent to truth and reality. We'll just use those words rather than absolute, infinite, omnipotent, omniscient, God. Any of those other words can be inserted into that. So these are concepts. From our thinking point of view, they're concepts, but if they exist, they simply exist. And again, going back to Anthony's point, we wouldn't have such clear indications in our thinking of what's wrong if we didn't have a premise that was right. If the premise we had was wrong, then wrong would be right, and we would feel great, and we would not be asking to feel better and trying to get better and looking for ways to look better and have people think of us better and admire us more and attend to us more if we weren't doubtful in the thinking we're doing. So the actual consequences of our experience are much more accurate when looked at accurately than we tend to take them when we're looking at them from the addictive thoughts that we're having about who we think we are. And we see them as things to get away from and run from, and we turn to compulsions and impulsive behaviors and reactive behaviors to other people. Those are all indications of something wrong inside. Why? Because I am defending, I am defiant, I am delusional and in denial about what I am doing in terms of my own interpretation of what's happening around me. And there's nothing more primary and immediate to me than my thinking in terms of my human experience, because my body has been given that brain to think for it in terms of survival, not in terms of suicide and addiction. Addiction is suicide. But in all these other things that we do as humans to destroy bodies, violence, homicide, suicide, all these things that are now at all-time highs are evidence something is malfunctioning socially that we're not talking about accurately and honestly. And it's probably not as complicated as it's been made, because prior to even beginning to witness my own involvement in what was going on, always complicated it as much as possible so I could use that camouflage cover as an excuse to continue to tell stories about things as excuses to justify I have nothing to do with it. And I had some pretty lengthy descriptions of what was wrong with society and the world and all the other things that had very much to do with my thinking, but I misplaced and mistook as what was happening outside me so that I could justify maintaining what I was doing as not happening, so that everything out there was happening to me rather than seeing it as something being done by me in terms of just my experience. All I was doing was affecting my experience. And lying has that effect. Lying has no place in the universe except in the brains of humans. It's a choice. And the choice to make believe that an illusion, a thought, which is an image imagined, all of a sudden becomes reality because we develop forms around it in our thinking and see things in terms of shapes and sizes and articulations, does not give those thoughts reality. It actually gives them great power, if there is any power in them, of imagination. to consider things. And if the one thing we're not considering in that great potential, let's not call it a power, let's just say the potential of it to express itself in ways that are useful and innovative and creative, if we're subverting that and using it to make believe that what is reality, we are now making believe that we are the creators of reality, and as a result bear the burden, while actually denying all of the consequences of that burden, which would again show how sick the thinking is to make believe that we could make that claim that we're responsible. We can create reality out of our thinking and then not be responsible for the actions that we take. Once again, there's a misalignment, a malalignment there. It's disconnected. That's inner conflict. There's no way we can oppose what we're doing in thought. And we can only think the thought must have a life of its own to think we can oppose it, as though it's something that stands beyond our own thinking, when we again use our own thinking to think we're going to deny it. We create it and then we deny it. That doesn't make sense. And it's the immediacy of the moment that we're talking about. It's now that we're talking about. If everything that's happening is happening now and there's nothing that's ever happened other than in the present, we're always talking about the immediacy of the moment to start with, because my experience has been it's the one thing that tends to be overlooked. By considering the past our direction to the future, we almost skip over the fact that we're always in the present and don't talk about it and look at it as our natural state of being, our natural state of awareness, our natural state of knowing awareness, which is intuitive. And intuition, by definition, is knowledge beyond reason. So knowledge has no basis in reason, and starts to become evident that there's something afoot here that might be worth understanding, so the thing that's afoot has some traction to actually take a walk, to step forward, to move in a direction that's productive and useful. When I become useful, I have something valuable to others, because it can help them become useful too. And the big benefit of usefulness is to see the benefit in others, to be helpful and useful to others. That's how we're designed to function as a collective species. Not as a bunch of disjointed people trying to prove how right we are by hurting and killing and maiming and opposing and oppressing other people. That's not the natural order of our design. But it's a possibility and it's a choice, and we're pretty good at that. If we can master that, we may be also very capable of noticing that that's the only thing we've ever struggled with, and start to notice that if we're interested in living at peace and expressing peace and having the natural expression of our natural state of being, which is at peace, expressed, that our body is perfectly designed to do that. That's exactly what we're here to do. That's exactly what our essence allows us. And it's exactly what we pretend we're not here to do when we start making believe that our thinking is true and real. So that's the essence of our conversation. I would say it's no less important than anything that we can talk about. Because if this paradigm has been discussed as it is, we are basically like people who thought the world was at the center of the universe and that the world was flat. And in both those cases, it led to very, very confusing outcomes that kept people from progressing in terms of their understanding about what was happening, because they became very dogmatic about the thinking attached to those limited ideas, and ended up thinking that they and the world were threatened by contrary thought, when the contrary thought was in fact accurate about what was happening in relation to the world being wherever it is in the universe, and not having to be at the center simply because we were looking out from it, thinking it must be in the center. That's the same sort of self-centered thinking that we think when we think how we see things is how they are, rather than simply how we see them. Yeah. That mistaken motion eliminates our potential to learn, because it creates a reactive state of denial and defense naturally, and delusion to make believe it's true, that once chronic begins to lead to all of the other disorders, because the thinking is out of order.
Yeah.
We act out of order.
I like when people say, well, it is what it is, It's kind of on that theory. It is what it is.
You're echoing a lot, Anthony.
Yeah, but it is. I like when they say it is what it is.
Yeah. Well, and think of that term. That's an absolute statement. You there?
Yeah, I'm here.
Okay. So that's an absolute statement. So our discussion is about starting to see that we have largely been mired in thinking about things in parts and pieces rather than thinking in things in whole, peaceful states. And when I focus on the bits and pieces, they seem to be all that there is because my focus magnifies them to the point that I don't see anything else. And I wonder why I stop feeling peace. I'm literally focusing on the bits and pieces rather than seeing that all the pieces add up to the whole. And if there is anything whole about the universe, it would mean that everything is everything, whatever it is. And we can actually think about the entire universe and life and all of these things that seem mysterious in absolute, concrete, honest ways by simply admitting they are what they are. And starting there, and starting to concede these things and recognize they've always been what they are, and they've always been doing what they're doing. We have largely taken a position that they are secrets and mysteries when they're not, because they've always been doing what they're doing to allow us to even think about them as a mystery. There's no mystery in that. But we can consider that as another bias to give us the impression that there is nothing else other than what we think. And defend it and fight and argue and, do what we do to make believe that the only friends we have are the people that agree with us, rather than see that the challenges from other people are giving us a chance to notice that perspective is always available and that trying to make a single point has no dimensional capacity. It's a single dimension. We live in a three-dimensional space, which is actually greater than that. It's actually multi-dimensions that we don't even see, and yet they exist. So typically our seeing sees in three-dimensional space. So to try to make a single point is pointless, because in fact, making a point confirms all other possible points rather than denies them. To think my point is right and all other points become non-existent would be to make my point non-existent too. So the twisted nature of that irrational logic becomes more obvious as it's looked at clearly and seen how loopy this thinking is. And insanity is considered loopiness. People get loopy. You go around and around and around and around. And insanity is not too hard to approach, by the way. We don't have to be completely mentally incapacitated to have an incapacity mentally that is disabled, that is ill, that is sick, that is mindless, that is thoughtless. It's very easy. It's very simple. One of our problems is thinking it's only the people that are displaying the worst aspects of what's going on, the worst possibilities, is thinking of them as something distinct from what we're doing, when collectively we're doing a lot worse than they're doing. Because the impact on the collective whole, making believe that the thinking we've been doing about the thinking we've been doing has had a dramatic impact on this planet that we're not even ready to look at honestly enough to do anything about. Except say, well, maybe in 30 years it'll really be bad, but right now, I'm going to do everything I can the same way. Continue. So to your point, Gabe, last week, this idea of principles, starting to see that if the problem is the idea that we think our thoughts are true, when in fact they're just illusory concepts we develop in a brain that's our brains are designed to analyze things to help us survive, not to figure out how to kill us. So when addiction, which is a slow form of suicide, overdoses, for instance, are at all-time highs, suicides are at all-time highs, it's not a coincidence that suicides at an all-time high while addiction's at an all-time high, because they're the same thing. It's the same thinking. Who I am is going to be relieved when I kill the body I have, because I think that who I am is what I think, and thus my brain and body become all I am. So the only thing I can do is get rid of the body, rather than notice that maybe the greater sense of knowing that I have as a being is some spiritually based thing, maybe even not a thing, but something that's present, isn't going anywhere when I kill the body, because there's nowhere for it to go. It doesn't live in the dimensional space that we're used to talking about and thinking with, because it isn't, the knowingness of that is beyond reason. It isn't based in reason, which isn't based in rationalization and justification. It's just knowing we know. And if knowing is knowing, we know we know. We are aware we're aware. We don't have to think we are to be. But when we begin to concede it in thinking, we introduce thinking rather than to these hysterical ideas that we create to continue to fight. We introduce thinking to nature and peace, and all of a sudden, intuitively, without thinking, know exactly what to do, just like our instincts are designed to have us do when we're in seeming emergencies. The twisted state of mind of anxiety and all the different disorders today is to think that the way to get over them is by maintaining them and treating them as symptoms, rather than seeing the cause that they're caused by is in the thinking we're doing, which naturally gives us an impression of being disconnected and apart from and lonely and all that kind of stuff, because the thinking we're experiencing is so disconnected as to not even be real. It's just being considered to be real with the same thinking that creates the image. We end up thinking the image is real because we can think about it, because we have this amazing capacity to think, and then turn the amazing capacity to think against ourselves by thinking we're going to kill ourselves slowly through addiction and try to feel better about what we're doing that's worse. So principles are starting to see that the problem, if it's only what we're doing in our thinking, then all of our problems are on that same basis. They're all being generated by what we think. And my experience was that when I began to notice the things I was thinking, it became a little daunting to look and say, oh, wow, I have been literally full of shit, a waste product of thought, a wasteland of imagination, destroying itself like trees charred after a fire that have no hope of ever coming back because the soil is completely contaminated. And then starting to see that it wasn't just those I was struggling with, it was also thoughts I didn't even think I was thinking. And as I began to concede that, it became more obvious that simply living in a relationship to them by recognizing that I must be doing something to be feeling what I was feeling started to dissipate them. And some of them became more obvious to me. Cultural ideas and familial things that I had held against people, and ideas I had about humanity, and all kinds of things. Anything that I see now that gives me a contemptful idea, spiteful idea about somebody else, I know is coming from some place that I think is hidden, but is expressing itself openly. And if I don't bother to acknowledge the expression of it as it is being expressed, I will continue to maintain the subterranean, seemingly subterranean, invisible aspect of that thing as though it's not there, because I don't see it. And what I'm really not seeing is my own understanding isn't seeing for me what's actually happening, because I'm misusing it again, because I can use denial as a source of trying to pretend it's not there. So while it seems huge at first to look at, or can, it's no bigger than the thought I'm having right now that it's huge and hard to look at. No bigger. There's nothing else to it than the immediacy of the thought, because it's the immediacy of the present that things happen. It's where I make my decisions. It's where I make my choices. And if the immediacy of the present is being overladen by the past and the future, I'm trying to use two areas, that two time frames. I'm literally time traveling, thinking I can go back and thinking I can go forward. And what I'm thinking about the past actually didn't happen the way I'm thinking about it, because if I can't even think of the present accurately, certainly I'm not remembering the past accurately. And if I'm struggling with acknowledging and recognizing the present, what kind of future would I expect but one that's doomed, which is not uncommon. And anxiety thinking is a sense of doom, pending doom. But it isn't the future that's doomed, it's the present thought that's doomed. It isn't the past that's screwed up, it's the present thinking that's screwed up. It's the inability or unwilling, it's not the inability, but the unwillingness to recognize I'm causing it now by making believe something other than what I'm doing is to blame. And in any way I use an excuse, I am telling a story trying to excuse myself for doing what I'm doing in all cases. So on a principled basis, that becomes pretty clear. And as I see that conflict, and as conflict is seen, you could pretty much just say, I'm up to something. Somewhere, something's going on in me that I am thinking, since thinking is so primary to every voluntary action we take, and watching things during the day has us think about them immediately. And starting to see that it's not them we're thinking about, it's what we're thinking of them that we're largely seeing. And as that becomes clear, you start seeing things with a much different perspective because they no longer are the horizon that seems to be the doom and end of the world.
Okay, so how do I actually use this now? So in real life, when I'm having thought that I don't like that something's going on, I'm upset either that I've caused it or I didn't get something or I don't like it. So
okay, so Anthony, you suggest that real life isn't where you normally live. If you're now listening to this and thinking it isn't real life, when in fact we're actually talking about.
When I said real life, I meant real life scenario, like in real when it's really happened, rather than just hypothetically Anthony, talking about it.
What would this be right now?
Talking about it's not really like I'm not having that thought where this is terrible.
Sure you are. You're saying it's not real life. That you want to figure out in some other time and space right now how to apply this that isn't even happening.
I didn't mean real life. I meant in action and using it in an actual circumstance.
Okay, so is this must not be an actual circumstance?
This is where everything's going great and I don't have a problem. We're just talking.
No, I think you don't think you're having a problem, but you're launching in a direction to think how you can apply it without thinking about how can you apply
I know
it
that problem is going to come. It always ends at some point during the day. I get this thought I don't like.
You are witnessing the problem right now and not even noticing it. Are you here? Are you here now?
Yes.
Okay. And you're talking about having some sense of peace, I imagine, because you're here thinking this is an exclusion.
Nothing's bothering me. I'm talking about solution. This is all solution driven.
Yes. Okay. So if you can have that state and be aware of it right now, and it's your natural state, can you conceive that maybe that natural state is always natural, regardless of the conflicts you run into in thought?
Well, how do you know it's the natural state, though? Because I swear a lot of times I'm having these thoughts more than just thought of normal.
Well, how you know, Anthony? You know how you know? You're at rest. You're at peace.
Yeah.
You have a sense of ease, literally. Does that mean there's no potential for your thought to develop conflict? Not at all. It means your potential is always the same. That's, I think, part of what Gabe was getting a little sticky about the happy, joyous, and free. To see this isn't to think it's going to stop forever, because if it were to stop forever, it would mean that all possibility was no longer possible. The freedom, the neutrality in Alcoholics Anonymous, for instance, or any of the other drug-related or obsessive-compulsive related programs. The neutrality is not about never thinking about it. The neutrality is recognizing when you think about it, what it is you're thinking clearly enough to say, certainly I can act on that thought, but does it make any sense to do something I've tried 1,000,000 times that doesn't work and think somehow it's not going to work again? And that's the same question you can ask when you feel that disability, Anthony. That seeming conflict. It's not about getting rid of the conflict. It's about beginning to notice that your thoughts are still conflicted, or your thoughts are conflicted.
I like that. I like to see them as conflicted. I usually don't see the conflict. I see exactly one side in a way.
Exactly. But there's the conflict, Anthony. There can't be one side in a three-dimensional observable world. There's always another side. That's the whole point of left and right, up and down, in and out. There's always two sides. Opposites attract because they're not disconnected. So the point I made about making a point, you can't make a single point without confirming all other possible points, because your point would have no point if there weren't other points.
Yeah.
It would be what we're talking about, an absolute state of being, making a point. It just is what it is, or whatever. Who knows? It doesn't need reason. So it just is what it is. It just is the nature of things.
And
So,
maybe that's part of the problem that some of the people have that have mental obsession, is that there's a lot of points. There's these different points.
how about you right now seeming to be trying to use other people and other points to try and come up with some new way of looking at it? Listen, Anthony, I don't dismiss the perspective in that and the broadening awareness.
Yeah.
Not dismissing that. I'm pointing out that if the immediacy of the moment is the presence that we always have, and what we do is constantly try to wrap thoughts and ideas around things that aren't happening, the presence doesn't go away. Our natural state doesn't disappear. Our experience of it begins to disappear.
Yeah.
And if meditation and prayer, for instance, are critical components of sobriety, which they tend to be, and you begin to look at the choices you make as your prayers, and you begin to look at the natural state of this peaceful knowing as your ever-present meditative aware state, always there, Anthony, always there. You've always had it. You've always known it. You've always been aware of it.
Aware of what?
That present knowing state. It's just like we talked to your dad about, which it took him a few weeks of fighting his legal briefs to come to finally say, oh, well, if there is a horizon and the world was always beyond the horizon, maybe the horizon of the thought I'm having is simply limited by the maintenance of the thought, and maybe there's something beyond that. And he sort of had an aha moment at 93 years old.
Yeah.
You remember?
Yeah.
He stopped. He looked up. His eyes went up.
That's what he does. Yeah. Good.
But he started laughing also and started sort of engaging at a different level. And he stopped a little bit quicker than he was initially.
Yeah, he didn't have to be so set in his ways all of a sudden, right?
Yeah, yeah.
That it's possible.
So if you're eating an apple and you haven't fallen too far from his tree, do you think that perhaps maybe some of those things he does you may have took for granted are the only things you can do, and things you continue to do and make believe someday if you get more desperate, you'll be able to utilize them in a way that'll be...
Or be upset that what you're doing isn't working. It's like you thought this was the answer, that this was going to make everything perfect, and it's not.
Anthony, I would suggest that our bodies are so clear when we're upset that it's not going to work. What we're really saying is we're upset with it not working right now. We know it's not working, period. It's not about what's going to work. It's about what's happening right now. Yeah. This is the essence of this conversation. This is what this conversation has been designed to talk about. You, Anthony, have been with me.
Yeah, that's a good conversation. That's a subject I like.
You mean you?
You said you, and this is what this is designed to talk about. You, Anthony.
Well, the point is that if what we here's a distinction between self-centered thought in the sick way and thought in the absolute way.
Right.
Self-centered thought, like the point you were talking about making, says my point excludes all other points.
Right.
What does that do? That creates a lack of peace because it puts me at odds with everyone else.
It limits it.
It doesn't even limit it. It just limits our impression of it. And what is that? Depressing.
Yeah.
What do we become? What do we become? Dysfunctional. All of a sudden, we've limited through our own thought, our own functional capacity. So we end up getting depressed and worse and worse and worse.
And
we can't even talk to people.
And what I'm thinking about, when I'm unhappy about something, I'm unhappy because I know it's going to be like that in the future. It's not so much that it's bad right now.
Exactly.
It's that I'm worried about how it's going to, well, this is going to be always like this now. And it's not even bad now.
So, well, you're trying to apply the dysfunctional thinking about past and future into the present by condemning the present to the same thing you're condemned by imagining time and space. You're space traveling, literally traveling in space and time.
Yeah.
In your thinking. which even physicists are wondering whether or not is even possible. And what's interesting about that, which I say lines up with the absolute state of being, is that if it's possible, they think of it only as possible going forward, never backward. So what's interesting about that in relation to an absolute knowingness is that it's always new. The lack of dimension in it that's relative is that there is no end. So there's no time continuum in it. So the present moment as the presence is always new. Why is it new? Because it never gets old. It's not in time or space. It's a present knowing awareness that exceeds the bounds of thought, just like the world always exceeded the horizon, even when it was thought not to exist.
Yeah.
This is looking at thoughts as bubbles and seeing that whenever you look at a ball, you can pick up a softball. You cannot see both halves simultaneously. You can spin it around, but there's time in between the spin, so you're not seeing it simultaneously. And the impact of our thoughts is simultaneous, now, always now. So what we're blaming is only what we're thinking exists while we're denying all that exists in the absolute present moment.
That makes sense. How about the fact, and you've been saying this for years now, and all of a sudden it makes sense is kind of the funny part. I don't know why. Maybe because I needed a new Ferrari for.
Am I getting more intelligent?
No, I think I needed that new Ferrari to make it. Like without the Ferrari, it doesn't make so much sense.
No,
But how about this?
You're suggesting that if something is true, it's not because I'm talking about it. It's because it's true. So if you become
on that side, the weight, it has more weight.
I don't think it has any weight, and that's the gravity of the situation is the resistance we create by making things matter.
That's funny.
Thinking they mean so much and they matter so much, and they're so.
I'm always trying to put weight to everything. That's what I go around weighing things. I'm making some more on this side, and then I'll weigh the way I want it to weigh.
You're pouring concrete around your feet and wondering why swimming gets tricky. Think about it.
So here's my theory that I just came up with. They've always said as a kid or as a time, like you can't have two thoughts simultaneously. It's only possible to have one thought. That is very limiting.
Well, let me ask you a question. If that's a thought and you're thinking about it, is it true?
No.
Okay. So it shows how thought doesn't seem to function the same way that things matter. Think of this. We think our thoughts matter so much that they turn into matter and become what we call real, because matter to us is real, right? And yet matter can't occupy the same space. Two things that matter can't occupy the same space at the same time. But again, in this discussion about perfection, if you start letting something be what it is, your duplication of it and allowing that has it become perfect no matter what it is.
Yeah,
So
this is great meeting because it's just us three, and one of them's a scientist. So this is like some setup.
Well, Gabe and Sturgis, I think, both have.
Oh, Sturgis here?
Yeah.
Oh, hey, Sturgis.
Hey, guys.
Oh, this is great. Oh, this is really good. I don't know if I'm just ready to hear it or it really.
Yes, that's what I was saying, Anthony. I wasn't trying to bloat my own ideas of intelligence, because my experience is that it isn't through intelligence that we get there. It's through knowing that we are there.
Or just say that there's two sides of even your thought. Like it's impossible to have a thought without there being another side. You can't have a thought without there being a reflection of the other side. There's got to be an opposite to everything.
So part of the point in this is that those things that you come to realize, like your eyes actually start realizing what's happening.
Realize.
They don't start happening because you decide they're real. Again, we get so used to thinking things are only what they are until once we think they are.
And in my world, that's the way it works. If I'm thinking it, it's going to be that way. Because if you're
that's the way it doesn't work.
If you're having thoughts,
that's the way it doesn't work. That's what's driven, Anthony. That's what's driven your manic tendencies, your ideas about more as being enough when it's never enough. All those things are driven by that premise. And your whole composure, your whole exterior view of how things are happening are driven by that. Now, I don't mean
That's the
whole
problem, because I'm like, why is everybody agrees with me? Yeah, because if you don't agree with me, you're not around me. So I only have people that feel the same way around that. If you don't think exactly like I feel or pretty close, I don't have people with different ideas around me. That would be totally conflicting, right? That's why you set yourself up that way.
Do you know what inbreeding creates?
They're
Do you know what inbreeding creates?
thoroughbreds.
No, it creates mental retardation.
Oh, yeah.
So if you're only hanging out with people who think like you and you're only trying to maintain the thoughts you have,
Yeah.
you're actually retarding your mental capacity by making believe that somehow or another, this drowning pool of stagnation will somehow not turn to poison. And it's so conflicted that you almost have to have, I would say, another thought opposing it simultaneously. If you're doing what you're doing and think you shouldn't be doing what you're doing, that's a major conflict in experience.
Yeah.
Now think about that.
Yeah.
Thinking is wildly capable. And we have misutilized it to the point that we have actually turned it into a liability rather than the asset it was designed to be. And in recognizing historically these things, Anthony, like you're talking about, I don't talk about this because I think I'm smart. I talk about it because I think it's obvious once I started looking clearly at what was happening. And if it's obvious, then that's something, going back to the point about points, self-centeredness in the small self is the idea that it's me against you and that we're all separate. When we start looking at the essence, it's what we all share naturally. That essence we have isn't something we have individually, it's something we share collectively.
Or just take the opposite side. So if somebody comes in your office and says, Todd, I'm having this problem with my job, my car, my everything. I don't like any of this stuff. You say, okay, so what's the opposite of that? They go, well, I wish that I really love my job. Then they could talk more about positive.
How about rather than that instance where all of a sudden you're a therapist in an audience and entertaining or in an office entertaining an audience, what about right now?
Yeah, it works. Like, instead of me being so mad about the stuff I don't have, I could just think about the opposite of that. It's like, God, I wish that I could visualize having all that stuff instead of just focusing.
You're also talking, like we talked about a year or 14 months ago, about the teeter-totter.
Yeah.
It's a management style to begin to notice that there's always an opposite to everything we're doing within a relative decision-making process. There's always an opposite, is to see that we're always in perfect balance. It's only when we start to think that only one side of the teeter-totter is right and the other side is wrong that we start to see the imbalance.
Yeah, and I say once a day, probably, I could, like, it happened the other day where I was wrong. I didn't attach an email, whatever it was. I was wrong. And I said, I was wrong. And it's a little uncomfortable to say that. It kind of feels good, but I do it maybe once a day, once every 2 days. But imagine how many times
you're probably missing several hundred opportunities.
Yeah, I'm only missing about 1 million. And I remember exactly being able to say that I was wrong on those 2 occasions, So I got to open up to maybe I'm wrong more.
Anthony,
I think that's the problem.
Anthony, if you can be right, you can be wrong. Period.
Yeah.
Period.
Yeah.
And that's
if
within
there's a
thinking.
Possibility. You're saying if the equation is you can be right, that means you have to fill in the rest that you could be wrong. It doesn't say you're always right.
Only within your human
you're always right.
Only within your human experience and thinking. In an absolute sense, there is no wrong and there is no right. There's just everything that's possible. Always.
So that's why it's funny when the person you were working with said, "How's it going? What's going on?" And he said, "Well, apparently everything." What's going on? Apparently,
right now, the immediacy of the moment is where everything's happening right now. And so all of the other ideas you're coming up with are trying to manufacture something as though you'll come up with a new plan for some time that doesn't even exist, that you'll be scraping for and wondering where it is in your briefcase of thoughts that you've now collected and wonder why you feel convoluted and heavy in your thinking. So the point is,
fucking briefcase isn't even opening. Damn it,
Anthony.
Yeah.
If your case doesn't need a case and it's present, where you
Yeah.
are, and that's who you are, and that's what we all share, not because I talk about it, not because we talk about it, because it is as it is. And we're willing in any way to begin to start to concede that our thinking is the only thing that's ever been causing any conflict in relation to it. And the conflict it's been creating is all delusional because it's just a preoccupation with thought that has no basis other than its own preoccupation.
Well, if you take it a step farther, though, it's not, thinking does nothing, but the thinking leads to action. So everything you're thinking is causing you to do stuff. So it's not just your thinking that's causing problems. It's because you're thinking that and now you're there and doing that. That's the problem.
So you're starting to see the relationship to my contaminated thinking leads to all the problems that are out, all of them. And as a collective whole, as a species, all of the problems we are facing are not an odd coincidence or some strange confluence of events that some hateful power has thrust on us. They're absolute reflections and consequences of each of all of our decisions collectively.
There's a correlation, you're saying?
Yeah, there might be.
Hey, Gabe, how do you think about this? This is a perfect question, just a little deviation. My brother, he heard a whole lecture.
From a deviance, a little deviation.
But the thing he was interested in is that Jack had mentioned that a thought is an action. He said, that's not a thought. If you take a thought, if you think about getting off the freeway, is that getting off the freeway? It's not. So the question is a thought an action?
Yeah, I would say it is.
You just described it as, Anthony, that it leads to all actions. If they're intimately connected, then what would it be? Isn't it interesting that we've thought it wasn't? Go ahead, Gabe.
I thought, get it. Well, I still having a hard time with that one. Just if you're just thinking about something, is that really an action? You're just
why you're having a hard time with it, Anthony? Because you still want to entertain all those insane thoughts and think someday they'll become true. And to think of them as actually actions starts to actually put the onus of that process on you rather than think of it as some strange confluence that's affecting you and happening to you rather than being done by you.
Yeah,
it's really simple. This is all so simple. But I'm sorry that I interrupted Gabe. I'm seldom sorry, but I interrupted Gabe. I could see that he was going.
No, well, you could also think of it as just using actions use up energy, whether you're jogging or even sleeping. Sleeping's an action. That your thoughts are taking up energy, synapses are firing and exchanging molecules of chemicals and all those.
So they're happening.
They're happening. Yeah.
Yeah. So for us to think what's happening isn't happening would be a pretty major conflict. And if we
always
think,
like when you say, go ahead.
If we think a natural essence that doesn't have all of the functional capacities that we do as humans, but is simply a knowing of knowing and an awareness of awareness that provides the capability for us to even think and function, it doesn't sit around making choices. The choice it made was to give everything it is to everything that is. That's the choice if there was one. But I wouldn't say if there's no beginning or end, there was a choice, because a choice would have had to start and end at some point. So it's just a present state of grace, a loving state of awareness, generous to the point of never having been withheld, never having been shy of everything there is available to all of us all the time. And if you look at nature, it's pretty good evidence of that, because nature has provided for us, despite the way we've taken care of it and mistreated it, or not taken care of it and mistreated it, is continuing to provide all of the things we consume today, including the food and the air and all of that, to have us at a population greater than has ever existed on the planet. It's pretty good evidence of something that's generous. And it seems to know what it's doing without having a lot of attitude or putting its hands on its hip and disqualifying certain people from being part of it. Everybody's breathing the same air. Everyone is held by the same gravity. Everyone is spinning right now at the same speed. Though I wonder if people at the equator are spinning a little faster because the circumference at that
Yeah,
point is
that's what I was
different
going to wonder.
because there's an axis. And so whatever they are, wherever they are, if anyone else was there, they would be doing exactly the same thing. So if there's slight deviations to that, excuse me. But the point is that we think we're not moving because everything is moving with us while we are traveling in space at miles an hour.
That's bizarre.
So you can't have a Ferrari, Anthony, that can compete with that speed.
Yeah.
So having everything, if we're unwilling to even imagine we do or consider we do, would be to make believe all we have is what we think. And I would say that's a pretty depressing state. And depression is an expression of that awareness.
Hey, no, you know, it's interesting. I was going to bring this up. It's the band we saw last night. It was called Imagine Dragons. And he's actually stopped the show a few times to talk about getting therapy, because I just want to tell you that therapy is okay and you should embrace it. And he talked about his sister-in-law killed herself from mental. But it was interesting because there were a lot of
guys. As popular today as it's ever been. It is at an all-time high per se.
Yeah,
Addiction,
and the name of the
suicide.
band, really good, is called Imagine Dragons. And you're talking about imagining. It has to do, it's almost, I don't think they picked the name that way, but it is funny.
Well, it's easy to see how sick the thinking must be that to consider the one thing that would solve it is the last thing people tend to want to consider. The simplicity of it,
God.
The immediacy of it right now, the immediacy of that piece, recognizing it's always been our seeming backdrop, but effectively our essence, not some chosen trait. It's the essence of our existence, all of our existence, something we all share in absolute intimate terms. And to make believe that isn't our basis, where we are always is to make believe somehow that all that is there is what we think, because thinking has such a dramatic impact on our experience.
Not what we're doing. Like, oh, that's interesting.
But that's what we're doing if what we're thinking is in fact the thing that we're doing in relation to the absolute state of being. If we're thinking it isn't there, thinking becomes our exclusive source. And when we think about our thinking, we create a self called ego, because thinking of itself thinks up a self called ego. It's thinking of itself. What is that? Self-centered. What's it centered in? Thought. That's it. Who we think we are is not who we are. But who we tend to defend and be anxious over on a pretty regular enough basis that it's hard to even reckon with when the consideration is posed. Literally posed a consideration. The whole imposition of an ego is completely posed, but we think it's real. So posing the question that it may not be seems even more difficult to face, because it's really facing the lies of our ideas that we have about who we think we are. Period.
Yeah.
Period is a point at the end of a sentence. And if the life sentence that we have given us seems destructive and impossible, it is not destructive or impossible, nor has it ever been, but to the thoughts we're entertaining. Period. That's it. Case closed.
Yeah, it was insightful.
Well,
but I have to
Anthony,
be reminded every week. That's another thing. I don't like to have to refresh this weekly.
Here's the difference. Our history, and Gabe, this is something good for you, because you had a major transition this last couple of weeks in terms of noticing how we can be caught off guard by the things we think aren't there, and then begin to feel once more bad about our plight, as though it's something that whole condemnation starts coming up against. Because if the thinking we don't think we're doing is based on the same ideas we have, it's been a mastery of denial. So when we start looking at them, that denial pops up as an option to say, well, I could just start denying this is actually happening and feel better by trying to do something on the opposite, Anthony.
Yeah.
And all of a sudden, I'm just repeating the same thing and thinking it by postponing it, like I'm going to push it off into the future. What is the future? Doomed. What am I going to feel? Doomed, impending doom. It isn't an accident. It's an immediacy that we experience and then deny because we think somehow it'll get better.
Why does the impending doom feeling come?
Because we're feeling the doom of the thought. And we're thinking we're going to push it off by denying it's happening now once more, because
I see. We're just pushing it off.
Here's the difference, and something, Gabe, for you to think of as you're in the face of that, because my sense is you made a huge transition, Gabe, in starting. You had seen immediate relief and thought that relief meant fixed forever.
Yeah. When we
And
all
didn't
know that's
notice
not possible.
that some of the things you hadn't ever even looked at had also been the landmines in your seeming subconscious. I mean, think about, we talk about the subconscious openly and then think we don't know what it is or what's in it. That's pretty silly. So you say, oh, well, that's dark. That's over there somewhere. As though when we turn the light out, if we turn the light out and we have bills on the desk, we have nothing to pay. It's just silly.
That's funny.
But to begin to see that, while it's daunting at first, it's because it also reveals all of the other mechanical structures we built in our thinking to be evasive and pervasive and persistent in our insistence that it ain't me, babe. It's happening to me. How does this happen to me? Why am I so fucked? Why am I so bad? Why am I chosen for this? Rather than seeing that you're actually beginning to witness the ugliness, the discontent, the disconnected ideas, the baselessness, the lack of substance, the thoughtlessness accurately. Here's the difference, though. Nature heals itself. We have been so chronically ill that we think we're going to fix all of the bits and pieces that were broken by thinking about them in a new way, the same way we used to think about them in a new way by denying them and postponing them and having them build in our system, which we've yet to face accurately. Because the tendency is to go back to what we've always done within thinking. That's the addiction. But the reality of the situation is that when we begin to consider reality as real, it starts to bring a light in that eliminates all that darkness. And the clarity of that light helps us to see what's wrong more clearly. It doesn't make what's wrong bigger. It makes what's wrong obvious while we've been acting oblivious to it for decades, centuries, and millennia. It's simply there as a thought opposing a thought, and that persistence to resist is the conflict of inner conflict and emotional turmoil and anxiety disorders, because we put thinking first and everything else goes to hell until we get our thinking solved. And if you think about the thinking you tend to do, it tends to be very myopic and very self-centered about what you need to do, and what anyone who conflicts with that is an irritation. Anyone. So meaning almost everyone is an irritant, because anything that has to happen that isn't on the schedule in your own brain seems to be a threat. It's pretty good evidence that we're relying on thinking as our only source. So the introduction of light and nature is to begin to see those things clarify, so the depth of what we're looking at becomes more obvious. And it can seem more daunting because we're still struggling with, how do we let go of these old ideas that seem so necessary because I've used them so long, when in fact they're just a replay of the same old tapes that are slowly dissolving and disappearing as the light comes up. As the dim light comes up, the shadows disappear.
So Jack, are you saying though that the way to help dismantle those old beliefs and old ideas that are part of sort of a chronic detrimental stress response is through repetition, like through exercises like this, reminding? I mean, I know I have to remind myself every day, every other thought in a way. And, you know, this particular conversation helps, whether recorded or active like it is live right now. Yeah. Are you saying that there's a critical repetition to it, because my sense is something biological happens when we have a thought, right? There is like a physical electromagnetic neuroendocrine signal, right? If that's a
Absolutely.
word, that causes our organs and muscles to relax. I mean, for me, I've been having sort of toxic thoughts. You know, there's a whole movement dedicated to this called epigenetics, right? Which is focused on the science of belief, right? And that positive, healthy thoughts create positive, healthy changes in our bodies, right? And negative, toxic thoughts cause negative, toxic changes in our bodies. And I think what I'm asking is, it sounds like you're saying that there's a critical repetition to correcting thought. That's what it feels like to me, and practicing and practicing and practicing, which for me, when I correct those thoughts, I form new thought patterns, and that starts to give way to even my everyday speech. I'm reminded that words matter. You remind me of that when, you come for me if I say something that isn't aligned with the absolute. And that starts to replace my negative thinking, my negative talking about my childhood, my work, my challenges. To your point a second ago, difficult people in my life being irritants, my pain, right? But it does seem to me that there's a tactic unearthing here, which is just that repetition being critical. Just steering the wheel correctly.
But think of an absolute source as not repetitive, but constantly new, right?
Yes.
So if we're beginning to contemplate something that doesn't fit all of these other dynamics that we've used to feel better about what we're doing that's wrong, because in one sense, Sturgis, I think you're right on it, and we're all on it. In another sense, I think we get stuck in the looping thoughts that we've used in the past to feel better. And if they're starting to look at belief, they're starting to see that belief is never believable because it's really simply trying to dispel the unbelievable nature of its thinking. Right? There's a balance there that comes. So the more belief I have in positive thoughts, the more I'm actually confirming I'm maintaining negative thoughts by ignoring them. And I think my new mode of doing it is going to be balance, which it certainly can. But if I constantly have to maintain that, I'm just in a new obsessive form of thinking that seems to be positive all the time, while in fact the negativity hasn't been let go of because I've given it credit undue. And you started with asking, how do we dismantle it? Start to see that there is absolutely nothing there than we think is there. Nothing to those thoughts. They are numbers over a denominator of 0. And it does not matter how big you make that number, they will never be more than that. And to any degree that I think a 1's going to show up in the denominator, I'm giving them credit that's undue because I'm imagining what isn't there to be there because I can think it might be there, when baseless thoughts, non-substantive thoughts, have no life whatsoever other than what I think. And how do I maintain them? Fight them.
Right. And I know that, right? I know that. I guess
you think you know that.
No, I know that.
Good. Okay. So you're speaking in an absolute sense. Yes.
Yes, exactly.
Good.
And that
Good.
I'm using that word purposely. I know that.
Yes.
However,
Good.
I think I don't, because my brain has been at work.
Therein lies the rub.
My 2-pound mass of water and fat and neurons has been at work thinking I don't know that for years. And so now there's a difference between me and my 3-month-old daughter right now, who doesn't think, whose brain, whose mass of water, of fat and water has not been at work.
So your observation of her is giving you a sense of clarity of your own clarity.
Yes. I'm also pointing out that I suspect that there is a tactic here that because my brain, my thoughts have been at work in many wrong directions against what I know, right?
And you know what that is?
I have some work to do to reprogram, to dismantle.
Thoughts.
This is that work, I might add, right?
Like all those thoughts, Sturgis, all of those thoughts have no basis, and that's why they require constant mental attention. It's exactly what obsessive thinking is. They don't have any basis, so the only thing they're based on is our constant refusal to concede what they are. Okay?
Right, because I didn't have those thoughts at all.
Let me stick with Sturgis for a second, Anthony.
No, I mean, as far as Sturgis is Sturgis is the only one that had those thoughts. I didn't have those thoughts. So they've got to be in Sturgis's head. If that makes sense, because I didn't think those same thoughts about Sturgis being in a job he didn't like. So the only person that was thinking it was Sturgis.
Well,
I wasn't even describing me. I was describing cultural direction.
believe the specificity of his thoughts are independent from your specific thoughts is to make believe again they have some life of their own, rather than see them as the joint consideration of this exact same thing you do with different faces, places, and times attached.
Right. No, I understand that, but that's why I'm confirming that. Like, because those are our only, it's not the only person that do, like you always say, where do you put those thoughts that you're having? Can you lay them down
So
by
you
the
didn't
door?
just hear me. They're the same thoughts you have with different faces, places, and times.
Right. I know. I heard
You're
that.
thinking that they're distinct because you've assigned different traits to them, but the underlying issue is identical.
Right. I understand that. That's what I'm saying.
Yeah, and I was actually trying to generalize what I suspect are similar themes within all of our toxic thinking, about the things we think are our problems.
Yeah.
So, Sturgis, one way to approach this is to look at it from a thinking basis. Think of what reminding is. It's as though we have no mind until we remind ourselves, right? We are literally recreating our mind. What is that? It's done in thought. If we have a knowing nature and begin to concede that knowing nature, rather than think of what we can do in thought to give us the impression that knowing nature there and begin to concede that the knowing nature is always there, that essence that you witness in Lady is in fact the exact same essence that we all share. She just hasn't gotten good at avoiding it and denying it in the exact way that you said. I just think I'm not. My contention is we know, we just don't think we know. And that's
I completely agree. Yes,
that's
and I think, and we all know, and I accept and love and you know.
So if that's the case, and we leap back into trying to feel better about what we're doing, the reminding, as soon as a lie is uncovered as being something that it isn't, and the awareness that only a thought that it is what it isn't is what's maintaining it, all lies become susceptible to that awareness and all of a sudden begin to dissipate. It doesn't mean, though, that our bodies, and I suspect this is part of the point you're getting at and trying to make, forgiving is allowing things to be as they are. Why? Because it's giving. What is an essence of love? Giving. What is an essence of an absolute source? Infinitely giving itself in full, not in part and pieces, not sometime, somewhere, somehow, some people. It's all, always, always, period. Can't be infinite if there's an exception to it at all anywhere. A bubble in it would destroy the whole concept.
Yes,
right?
that is the point I'm trying to make. And I guess just to kind of to round that, what I'm pointing out is that, and we've sort of hovered around this a couple times before, I think. Yeah, we've been at it for a while, but yeah. But the here we are again at something I get to often in this conversation, which is that it seems to me that the basis of experience, or there have been experiences, you've had experiences like that. I mean, I often point out, the moment in the narrative of someone like Eckhart Tolle's life where he simply just like snapped out of it on a bench, right? Yes. And he never went back into old reprogrammed thinking. He never went back into old thinking. My sense is after you had a somewhat similar experience after writing for a long time, having a sort of panic attack, and you sort of snapped out of it in a terrifying way. But, and you haven't gone back as dramatically as I feel I go back on this.
Well, it's Sturgis. All you're talking about.
I guess what I'm saying there is, if there's work to be done, all I'm saying there is, if there's work, maybe optimizing our environment. When I use that in quotes, right? Like our environment to reduce these sort of chronically activated stress responses, so we can do what our genes are actually designed to do, as much as they are designed to express negative health. To answer that, the trick there seems to be given all I've heard from you and what we do and are doing right now on a weekly basis, and when we talk to each other throughout the week, is practice it, to repeat it, which replaces our belief systems of negative thinking from those things that we've learned that we thought were right, but we know are not. And it starts to retrain us.
Well,
and that recreates our environment, quote unquote, which is, of course, the reality that we were all born into and have, a God-given right to be a part of.
If we're making a plan for the future right now, and this thing that we're going to start doing, that's all happening within the concept of thought, because to an absolute state of being, all those wrong things we think don't even exist. They have no basis whatsoever. And to launch off on a new path, which is what humans have done for eons now.
Yeah, that's my point.
To come up with a new journey, because we think we forget and we need to remind. Forgetting is another self-centered idea, because it's all about what I can get from the thing I'm about to do. And if I have an infinite source and need to do something to get for that, that means I'm more powerful than that source, when in fact the power I have has nothing. The power of that thought has no basis whatsoever, because I've already got the power. It's already with me. And I am not suggesting that this isn't an exercise.
Yes.
And that there isn't something to do. But if you look at forgiving and forgetting is about self-centeredness. And what do we do immediately? Forget that we have that source of forgiveness. We forget because we start thinking what we're thinking is the reality we're trying to overcome. And we create the exact brand new way of wrapping this in a way that we're going to end up contending with for the rest of our life. And think that we're on a better path because it feels a little better and it feels a little more developed and it feels like we're incorporating all the most modern thought. But in fact, if that absolute nature doesn't see any of the wrong, because it's all just illusion and thought, it's all what a brain is doing. It's all the misutilization of our brain to have an imagined thought and make believe it's real and true. As soon as I cross that threshold, I begin to think who I am is what I think. And all I am is what I think. And as a result, I'm constantly struggling with my thinking to feel better about myself, and going off on an exercise and thinking the exercise is trying to get better with how I feel, while I'm actually maintaining the things that's worse, would again replicate the whole problem. So you started with, how do we dismantle it? Is to notice that it is not on the mantle.
Well, let me
But stop. Stop. Give me a second.
Okay.
I know you got a lot of ideas, and this is exactly the chronic.
Well, I was just going to point out, give me your definition of what we're doing right now. If we're not dismantling it, what would you call this? Because this is what we should be doing, right?
What is it if it's a delusion?
Well, what we're doing right now, Jack, is not a delusion, right? We're together.
What we're thinking in terms of our thinking, I would suggest that we are probably maintaining some ideas right now that have no basis, that we are fighting for in the face of an absolute knowing awareness, to try to straighten out as though somehow it's up to us to straighten them out when we're the ones twisting them right now and thinking we're going to get better, when in fact we're just creating a new yarn.
You're not going to get a fight from me on that. I know those are just ideas that there's some skeleton key that I can erect in my brain that's going to unlock all this. I know that I don't need to. I know that it's my God-given right. What I'm poking at is, what are we doing right now? If dismantling that and the exercise of it is the wrong terminology. Don't think you and I right now that
the terminology, Sturgis, is an expression of what we're thinking. Our words follow our thoughts, and we do our best to use them. And it's an art form to be able to communicate, because words don't really replicate what we're thinking, but we attempt to use them. And they're always coming up in shortcomings as a result. They're always somewhat defective in that expression. But if what we're talking about is what Anthony was talking about earlier, seeing his thoughts as distinct from your thoughts, if I'm trying to describe my thoughts, you're never going to see what I'm seeing. But if I'm talking about something we share, the seeing of it is the beginning to concede it and say, oh, that thing is what we actually have now to express, that actually is who we are, our essence. And if I focus on that even for 10 seconds and start to allow my thoughts to follow that, that practice is so natural, I will never forget it and start to see clearly the disjointed nature of those conflicted thoughts are simply coming from ideas that aren't true. Period. Done. Over.
Yeah,
Every one of them.
I accept that too. I guess what I'm trying to do not is describe my thoughts, but more point out the eternally large, multifaceted, layered microcosm of what affects my overall wellness, our overall wellness, and that sort of trifecta between our mind, spirit, and our brain, which somewhere in there is thoughts. That's what I'm poking at, which I suspect is what we're doing in this conversation.
If my thoughts are in any way making believe that what I think about that trifecta incorrectly, I am managing lies that create forgetfulness so I can deny being involved in the creation of those things. That's a typical addictive response.
Correct. Yes.
And if I begin to concede,
on that.
If I begin to concede that I know better, part of what I think you're asking, and I certainly have ideas about what you're talking about, because my suspicion is that so much of what we think we're doing is only what's happening now, when in fact everything that's happening now we're not completely aware of within our own thinking because it's been corrupt for a long time.
That's what I'm saying. Yes.
But I want to go to the other side of that. We actually know exactly what we're doing because it is the sum total of our experience right now. And we deny that by making believe there's something else we need to do, somewhere else we need to do it, some other way than we're doing it, by simply not acknowledging the sum total of what's happening that's ever happened is the present moment. Everything that's ever happened is what we see when we drive down the street. Everything, the sum total of everything that's ever happened, everywhere anything's ever happened, is the sum total of everything we witness every day. And if that's the case, the sum total of all of our thinking, buried, past, future, all the ideas we have, is the sum total of our experience right now. So to say we don't know that and need to get to it is to mistake what we're doing. So as it comes up, we see it as something we should or shouldn't be doing and start this whole cycle of thinking where we are isn't where we should be and what we're doing shouldn't be happening. And all that stuff starts all over again.
Sure.
So to see it broadly is to begin to witness it as you go forward. My sense is the ultimate answer to your question is talking about this to others, which is one of our basic forms of communication. Since we're all intimately connected and all know this common basis, if I talk about it with others, which is why I do what I do, it gives me a chance to notice my own shortcomings in communication, because a lot of those shortcomings are still attached to ideas I don't even think I'm thinking.
Yes, thank you, and that's a great illustration in a simple way of what I mean. I think what we're doing right now, you and me, in talking about this in, although I hesitate to use the word, the correct way, is sort of fortifying our interconnectedness, right?
Yes.
Which of course has always been, which of course has always been. But that also, Jack, this is the reason that we do this every week and every day, and is because it is fortifying, and it is. I mean, I know it's not the right word, but I don't hate the word. No, dismantling the belief system that we've had for so long, that we do this instead, right?
But
because it fortifies the interconnectedness that we've gotten away from somehow. At least I've gotten away from. I get away from. I'm determined. My brain, my thoughts, when they're toxic, are determined to get away from that God-given interconnectedness that we all share. And I think that is the work that you do.
I would say your fortitude is literally just confirmation. And that's what happens in conversations. What my experience was, when I started noticing the reactivity in others, I began to appreciate that they were struggling with what I was struggling with, rather than just see them as reactive idiots that I didn't want anything to do with. Right. So those irritations became guidance systems to my own lack. I saw the perspective was offering me a chance to look at my own experience, and as a result say, wow, I've still got a lot of faulty ideas that I'm nursing. And my sense is the reason we do this every week, Sturgis, or almost every week except the last week of the month, is it's evidence of my own willingness to continue to deny things that I'm doing.
Yes.
That's all that it is. It isn't that I haven't realized the full awareness of a fully aware being. It isn't that I don't know that. It's that I'm continually thinking on a basis that's corrupt. So when you say, I don't want to use the correct words, I would say talking correctly now relative to correct thinking is the critical nature of how to communicate this, because it starts to alert people to an awareness they have rather than stimulate the reactiveness that basically covers that awareness up or tries to, right?
Right.
So if I tell
right.
people they've got to listen to me and this is my job and you better listen, what am I going to get? A listener? No, I'm going to have people start listening to everything they're thinking, which is going to be defensive and protective and reactive for the most part.
Right.
And I see it often. I don't see it exclusively because I begin to see, wow, they're just basically expressing the same failure that I am approaching them with to have helped cause that in them. What am I doing in my approach? What am I saying? If I'm being perfectly honest, I think it would incite a riot.
My wife would agree.
Yes.
I'm laughing because she is my greatest teacher on that. And P.S. I mean, so is my daughter, right? I mean, there's an energetic approach that is a new lesson to me, right?
Well, but if you know everything in a knowing way, it isn't new, except that it's always new. It isn't new information. It's a new awareness. Like Anthony was saying, gee, this seems more intelligent now. When in fact, what he's doing is seeing it as intelligible rather than counterintelligence.
Yes, I should say it's new to the, mind, body, spirit fort that I called the self that I thought I was until, I realized I wasn't.
Well, and here's the freedom too, which I think Gabe was struggling with a little bit. If I'm not prohibited from thinking about myself or thinking up a self or having a self to think of, that isn't the goal here. It's to just see it's what I'm doing that I'm doing in my thinking that's causing the conflicts I have when I start becoming concerned about what other people think. It's just something I'm doing. It would be no different than if I put on my socks and shoes and walked out the door with nothing else on. I would probably get a lot of attention. Right?
I do every time, yeah.
And to walk around wearing a tire on my head might have people say, what's wrong with that guy? And then I might think, well, wait a minute. I thought that tire really dressed me up. That really gave me a lot of traction. I thought it was attractive. So
it was good attire. You thought it was nice attire.
The things I choose to do, I would suggest always come with expectations, because I wouldn't want to do anything that I wouldn't want. Always. And it's starting to see that everything I do, I want to do. It starts to dispel the rumors I use to excuse the behaviors I do as though they're happening to me rather than by me, and starts to allow me to own what I'm doing in a way that I say, this has always been possible. I was never stuck. I only believed I was stuck so I could use it as an excuse to continue repeating feeling stuck. That's it. It's as simple as noticing it's what I do now that has the greatest impact, because the only time anything ever happens is in the present. And nothing in the entirety of time and space has ever happened at any other time than the present, because there is no past for things to happen in, nor is there any future. They're all just thoughts. And if that's the case, and I start actually looking at it, I'm going to see the things I'm doing much more clearly and laugh at what I do rather than take it so seriously as to think I need to overcome it. The overcoming of it is like figuring it out. If I need to figure it out, I'm claiming to be in something, stuck in something. It starts to dissipate the rumors I spread in my own thinking to give me impressions that aren't true, so I can launch off in some other path of obsessive thinking, and it's all egotistically based. It's all based in a self that doesn't exist. If I can overcome what I'm doing, and what I'm doing has no basis, I'm giving that thing I'm trying to overcome and fight a basis of even existing to be overcome.
Yeah.
It has no basis. It's not even there. Thank you for laughing, Anthony.
And I think what you answered,
but thinking it's there is possible. It's still possible. I still think things are there because I've chosen now to enter. You're talking about our productive capacity. My sense is as we become functionally literate and begin to read the responses we're having accurately because we're not defending against what we're doing, we're witnessing it with a clear state of present knowing, a mind that's literally our mind that isn't within the brain, but is clearly affecting the brain because the brain knows it, has known it all along, which is why it's in doubt most of the time, because it doubts what we're doing and thinking. The uncertainty isn't an accident, it's a consequence of knowing. And as I begin to do that and read the signs, the body language, and the interactive and interreactive language, I become functionally literate. And what do I become? Functional rather than dysfunctional. What do I become? Productive rather than unproductive. What do I become? Fulfilled in my awareness because I am fulfilling that awareness by expressing that thing you just mentioned. Our job is thinking's job is to express the absolute knowing that we have rather than determine it and conclude it and get to it and find it and uncover it and discover it and all that stuff. All those things are mental tirades attempting to claim our brain is the sole source of freedom when in fact we are free to think whatever we want so much as to think we're not free.
I guess the nice
lunacy.
thing about the important thing about thinking is it determines everything that you're going to be about. I mean, it's like you can't.
No, it determines everything you're going to do. Every voluntary, hang on, Philip's coming in. Every voluntary action we take is preceded by a thought.
Yeah, so it determines who you become in life is what you're thinking. So it's really important.
No, only if thoughts are real does it determine who you are. It simply determines what you do. Think of how much easier it would be, Anthony, to make a mistake if you simply recognized it was something you chose to do rather than think of it as something that you inherently are.
God, yeah, I feel.
Think of the difficulty of bearing that burden of those things.
That's where
That's
I'm
the
at.
past we tend to remember.
That's what I do is carry all that burden. So that was pretty freeing.
That's the regrettable past we tend to carry because we think it's who we are rather than say, no, I was an idiot when I did that idiotic thing. Or I wasn't an idiot when I did that idiotic thing. I just chose to do something idiotic.
Yeah.
Much different. A lot more freedom in correcting that than thinking it's some part of my genetic makeup that's never going to go away because it's just inherently who I am, when the essence of my being isn't based on my body and my brain. My brain and body have been given to me to express this essence.
Is that the rule 63?
I think it's 62, but you may know a better one.
Yeah,
you may have a bigger one.
Rule 62.
Yeah,
Don't
it's
take
the right to be wrong. Much different when you recognize you have the right to be wrong than thinking you should never be wrong.
Yeah.
And most defensiveness is about not being seen as wrong. It's where arrogance comes in. It's an increased sense of self-consciousness, concern, overdue concern, overblown concern of yourself, your appearance. How do you look? Isn't it interesting that self-consciousness is even recognized as an undue regard for appearance and not notice that it is actually suggesting that what we think within that consciousness must be pretty weak and vulnerable and sick?
Yeah, let me ask you a question. If somebody's very concerned how they look, so they're always presenting their best image and they make sure that they're always right.
So we're talking about you again?
No, my brother, actually.
Well, let's say, Anthony, you're using your brother to address issues that you struggle with.
Because it's not really me. I try not to be that person. But let's say somebody is like that.
Anthony, please. Please. Do you think it would bother you what he did if you didn't do it? If you didn't have the risk of that same thing? You think that would really bother you? Come on.
Yeah. So doesn't that make for a better person though? Because if you have somebody that's it's not somebody that's dressed
because you think your actions define your persona. Your persona is your character is a character you choose to promote and pose as. That's it. Your essence isn't a character, so it can't be defective. Character defects are based on ideas we have about our character that aren't true.
Yeah.
So what do? We inflate them or we diminish them? Grandiosity or self-pity? Pride or complete demoralization? There's never a middle point in those things because they're not true. We're trying to bring balance to something that's out of balance.
Yeah.
It's not natural. So Sturgis, to your comment, my sense is as we eke out a conversation about this from whatever vantage point we've chosen to take it from, because we're all seeing things from where we are, as our body tells us, right?
Mm-hmm.
If we're opening our language up to convey that, seeing how weak and disabled we've been and having that conversation is revealed by seeing how quickly we tell the stories and all these other things that we launch off to and gain this immediate sense of confidence, which is short-term gratification, just like a hit off of a joint or a drink or whatever it is. I'm going to feel better now because I have this thing and I'm going to do this. And rather than say, wow, the really facing of it is seeing the disturbing nature of my own inability to even communicate honestly. And accurately. You were talking about not wanting to do the correct thing, but the inaccuracy in our thinking is what we're struggling with. If we're not expressing a knowing nature that's natural, it's inaccurate to make believe it's true. And that dynamic is so common to our experience, we think it's always something to overcome rather than see it's only maintained by the thought I'm having right now that I need to overcome it, period. And as I begin speaking in terms, I begin witnessing the thinking I'm doing. If I begin watching my words, I begin witnessing the thinking I'm doing that are being expressed by the words and not always expressed very well. So I can always get a little better at looking at how I'm functioning, just like playing tennis or, riding a bike, whatever I can do functionally, I can get better by doing more because I refine my ability to do what I'm doing. If what I'm doing is simply expressing the present moment, I'm just basically always doing that. I've always been doing that, but the dysfunctional capacity has been reflecting the dysfunctional thoughts I've been maintaining, the ideas I've been making believe are true and real. So I've actually been doing the thing the whole time while making believe I wasn't because I wanted to disclaim the circumstances and consequences that I was creating. That's the forgetfulness of self-centered thought. I want to forget it.
So another way of rounding that corner that of the point I was trying to make is the repetition is you're calling it sort of a reminder of the forgetfulness. But there is a practice to it that I just think it's important to point out. Is an effective me, I'm always trying to extract to help remind myself
a knowing nature. I know, but if you're reminding yourself, you think there's a self to remind.
Yes.
So it's a brain thing you're talking
about.
Well,
I expect one of these moments I'll just simply assent, right? That's inevitable. No. But
listen, if the nature of our existence is essential, it's where we are right now. We're just misusing it and abusing it. Abnormal use is abuse. And to do it for a long time and think it's the only thing that we can do, and to think now we need to create a new exercise to overcome it, is to maintain that thought as being true when it isn't. So a mind that's knowing needs no reminding, ever, right? If that's our essence, that does not need to be reminded. What we're reminding is our thinking that thing is our essence. And as that's conceded, you will know exactly what to do, exactly the way you do when you're running from a bear and not thinking too much about it. Think of how quickly our bodies seem to know what to do without thinking when it comes to drastic threats. And yet this chronic, slow migration of this virus that we maintain a little bit all the time turns us dark and leads us to suicidal tendencies.
Well, and there's a good metaphor, right? I mean, there's a question there, or something worth reflecting on, which is that I think what you're saying is that we know when there's the metaphoric bear in our thoughts.
And we know that this is a problem, which is why we have anxiety and stress.
Right. And so that's another nice way of rounding that corner, right? So to sort of remind ourselves that we know.
But we've always known.
By pointing out the bear.
We've always known.
There's tactics there too, right? Like journaling helps me do that.
We've always known, though.
Yes, agreed.
So
we've always done that, and to remind ourselves that those bears in the woods that we have created in our own minds, pointing them out, naming them.
No, you're giving them credit. They're just delusional.
I don't know. I think there's a difference between shining a light on them and giving them credit.
Well, I will assure you that a bright, absolute white light has no shadows. Because
I have a flashlight. I don't have an eternal white light. I got a flashlight in my pen.
Your knowing nature is an eternal white light. It's the totality. Yes, okay. So if we have that, think of how we dismiss it by making believe all we are is what we think. Again, we think who we are is just our human experience.
But I'm going to pin you to practice for a second, though, Jack. Why do you pick up a pen and write every day?
To get better at speaking about this nature.
Yeah, because it helps. It helps.
But it's the denial of delusion, Sturgis, that I recognize.
So then for me, it's the same, right?
Okay.
I call it shining a light on the page by shining a light on the metaphorical bears, right? But that I've always known are there, and naming them helps me.
Addressing them correctly, though, helps you begin to see that you create the monsters you think you need to get away from or overcome. And there's a big beginning to see that they never had any power. 11 Step says
yes. And that's the amazing thing that happens for me in writing and then in telling people about it, right? Is we laugh,
but
what you get, how there was no
the
power.
Confirmation you get, you've always had, you just delusionally thought you didn't.
Yes. And again, I'm going to be back to that word dismantle here because I like it, but that helps me dissolve, maybe is a better one, that belief that it was ever there in the first place.
But think of the word dissolve. Break it down.
Yep, I'm going to Latin. Mm-hmm.
It's never been a problem.
Yes.
It's dissolve. Mm-hmm. What is dis? It negates solving. There's no problem in something dissolved because you're finally looking at it as a foggy notion. And when the sun shines, what happens to the fog? It just evaporates. Mm-hmm. Doesn't go anywhere. It's always there. It's always possible. It's just something we create. It's just something we think, and thinking is real. The idea that it's real is what we struggle with. It isn't the idea that we can think it. The thinking is hamstrung. Creativity is hamstrung by the idea that reality is what we think, rather than see that thinking is an absolute imaginative capacity we have to create innovation, to come to terms with solutions that can be perfected by expression, by being realized and actualized, by being useful as a result of the problems that we solve by them. And you look at what we have historically done with those great solutions, created problems so great as to threaten our own existence. Toxins, carbon, atmospheric problems, weather problems now that are showing up. These aren't accidents. These are consequences. Listen, the weather's been doing what the weather's been doing for a long time. And to some degree, it's what it's doing now. To say we've had no impact on that is corrupt in the age of modernity, and to not notice that those modern steps we took cause problems is to say they have no effect whatsoever. And that would be a bit of a stretch. And yet that's a lot of what's going on in the mentality that's starting to look at what's happening today, 50 years after the discussion began, maybe even longer, about what was happening. The warning signs went up in the 70s. We're finally starting to say, oh, maybe this is a problem we need to look at. Interesting how long we could act delusionally as a collective while witnessing the same thing that anyone in drug addiction or alcoholism does. Their whole life's falling apart, and they think the thing they really need is a drink to make it better. We're doing the exact same thing in thinking individually to be collectively denying what's happening and thinking the newest solution is electric cars, not noticing electric cars come with problems too. They're now searching the earth. They're searching other planets to find the stuff they need to make so much of it. They're going to tear mountains down to come up with the stuff. Just a new venture in another way that looks better and seems better and maybe doesn't pollute, but the actual process is going to pollute. And the batteries, they're not going to know what to do with the batteries any more than they know what to do with the nuclear waste. It's always been a problem because it's an unnatural creation, something that has a byproduct that isn't as fulfilling as a knowing nature could possibly express. It's the idea that everything in the universe is a mystery. It is not a mystery for us to exist. It is obvious for all of us, or we wouldn't exist and we wouldn't have any knowing nature. And we certainly wouldn't see things so clearly that are wrong.
Yeah, I mean, I struggle with that with technology.
Yeah.
You know, there seems to be great privilege and usefulness in driving and flying, and the same way there seems to be privilege and usefulness in the, you know, connectedness and speed with which we can connect, you know, digitally right now. But, you know, my sense is there's some nuance there.
Well,
in how fast the media moves that we're doing right now and the way that we're doing it right now. You know, I have a sense there's a difference between, say, a podcast and your ability to somehow reflect during that listening of that versus like something like Instagram, which simply triggers dopamine while you scroll the feed. You know, there's some nuance there worth examining.
If the ultimate nuance is absolute, then we're already connected. We already know what's going on. We're already immediately aware of everything that's happening around us. And that would include everything happening beyond what we think is around us, because all of that interconnectedness has always been our nature. And we simply haven't been talking about it honestly. So what do? Create things to look like we can finally communicate with one another so we can charge monthly bills, you know, and sell bills and all this kind of stuff. They're all metaphoric for humans' attempt to make believe that we need to create the solution rather than recognize nature has been created and it is our source and it is functioning and it is natural and it doesn't require our abusing it to get better or overusing it to get better or doing things that are unsustainable to get better. Plastic is a good example. They have no idea how to solve the problem. And every year we are increasing. I think last year there was 450 million metric tons of plastic produced. And every year it goes up about 5%, 5 or 10%. While we're all claiming to want to figure out how to recycle plastic and we throw it in a bin and think it's being taken care of, but they have no way of breaking it down to the point now that it's broken down so small it's getting into the organisms in the ocean, the fish, who then we eat. We have now plastic in our bodies in microscopic bits and pieces that can't break down because they're unnatural. And yet some of the best health food stores sell the best food in plastic containers. So
yeah, I mean, there's
we're
a Nobel
clearly
Prize
committed.
The guy who invented plastic, and now, you know, we're celebrating the guy who is best at cleaning it up out of the ocean.
So we're
not to mention the Nobel Prize given to the guy who told, I mean, this one's for you, the guy who proved our brains were hardwired, and now there's neuroplasticity happening. We celebrate that. It's a pretty good example of the insanity.
Well, my sense is that to some of your points again, and I hone this and drum this in every week because my own resistance to it obviously prevents me from communicating in a way that's assimilated or intelligible. And I know that I lack in certain regards in relation to that. But if the ultimate awareness of the present is awareness, then that intuitive knowing is not a reason-based knowing. It's a knowledge without reason. And if that's the case, I imagine a lot of these problems that we think will be taken care of by some outside force somehow, somewhere, are actually perfectly capable of being taken care of by us when we're looking at them accurately, because we'll know better.
Nice.
If I'm willing to address my situation now as it is, I become willing to look at capacities that I would otherwise not have imagined. And at least begin to think that if all things are possible, what's possible is for me to imagine only impossibilities, which is one thing I can do. But if I could be so good at that, isn't that odd that I would be so good at that and not notice that everything else would be possible? And yet that's the impossibility of this obsessive thinking, that a lie is a lie and it's going to be, I've got to correct it and I've got to fix it as though it has any existence. There isn't anything there. That's the whole problem. I keep thinking it's on a mantle and I need to dismantle it. I keep thinking it's something I need to take apart. I keep thinking in ways that give it credit that's undue. Not to suggest I can't do that. And by doing that, I begin to get a glimmer of understanding that if it can be so flexible as for me to change how I think about it and it changes, it has no real basis other than what I'm thinking. And when I'm opposing what I'm thinking, it seems to be like concrete, like falling into water from 100 feet. Water is very fluid until you start falling from 100 feet and it becomes a very solid surface quickly. My own approach is what I am bemoaning. It's my own thinking, not what I'm thinking about, but how I'm utilizing my thinking as though thinking is my sole source, rather than say, if I have a greater source, then I know exactly what to do and simply don't think so. Like you said, I just don't think I know. And to deny it would be to act on a basis that obviously would include denial. Once it starts, it continues. A corrupt seed, an oak seed tends to become an oak tree. Maybe there's some evidence of it becoming some other gender. I don't know. I don't know that that happens in nature. Gender may be more optional than the essence of a seed. I don't know. But oak trees have always seemed to be oak trees because if you plant the seed, you tend to get the oak or acorns. And with our thinking, if the thinking's corrupt, the action's going to be corrupt, the simultaneous thinking's going to be corrupt, we're going to make believe we're not doing it. And that internal conflict is evidence that we're doing it. If we start looking at it from the perspective level of saying, let me back off here and look at what I'm experiencing, the clarity of it starts to show that getting close to it makes me think it's all there is because it's all I'm looking at. When in fact, that's only a choice to make believe that focusing on it is in fact the only choice I have. Trying to make my point is the only choice I have. Trying to fight for how I think is the only point I have. And that would be to reduce everything I am to thinking. And again, confirm that thinking is truth and reality is in fact a major violation of thought. So I would say it's incorrect. And if we repeat it, we're going to suffer the consequences of making believe that we're less than and demoralized and unable and incapacitated and only humans, people say. Well, we're not only humans if we have any greater sense of knowing. And if we are only humans, and where was the knowing that created nature well before we even existed? Wouldn't that even indicate that somehow we are coming from a product of something pretty magnificent rather than something dull and boring and uninspired? We just reduced it to that. If all we are is a product of evolution, rather than seeing how was it the atoms knew to be atoms? Where did their knowing come from that they don't argue with and still do what they're doing today exactly the way they were originally designed, even if they have morphed and transformed into other things, elements and other things as a result of the heat and the radiation, the interaction that they went through, the process they went through. They did exactly what they're designed to do to have what we have today. Everything. My suspicion is if it were all a process of elimination, we would love the process. And we would relish in it. And if we didn't have any greater sense of knowing, it would be so normal as to be the high point. But I don't suspect we suffer in the ways we do because we don't know better. Seems pretty clear that we have a great sense of knowing that clearly indicates how wrong we can feel and how wrong we can see and how much wrong we can see in the world and others is a clear indication that we have a very strong sense of what is right. And I would say the difference between the two is one is useful, one is applicable, and the other is not, ever. And to function in ways that are useless is dysfunctioning because it provides no productive result, no gainful consequence, no gainful benefit for anybody, anywhere, anytime. It's just a preoccupation of thought. And it's no wonder we talk about getting our shit together and people being full of shit. People want to get their shit together, but hate being called full of shit. Think of the hypocrisy and the sort of denial in the words we use in relation to that. When shit is a waste, it's a byproduct, something to get rid of, to evacuate. Our body knows to even do that. And yet we maintain that kind of thinking as though our life depends on it. It's a lie. That's all. And a lie has no basis other than the idea that it can be true.
Well, I don't want to get you going, Jack, but
but
Stop while you're ahead, Philip.
I won't be gone if you do, Philip.
No, I just been listening and doing my TM while I was listening since I've gotten on. Now I'm done with the TM, but it was very helpful to listen to you because I guess let me take it to the personal first. The personal was, I've been having this frustration with, obviously I'm starting a new career, but not that, but with the acting. And I realized, I've been sending out these emails every week, like mass emails, like 400 contacts. And I've gotten some bites. And there was one in mid-August that I was really, I still have a couple offers from agents. And I have a manager who, when I went with her, I was excited to go. And then she's like, oh, I'm starting my own company. I'm like, great. But the point is, there was one agent that I really wanted to go with, and it didn't work out for whatever reason. They considered me, took them about 3 days to say, hey, look, we have too many conflicts on our roster for you at the moment. And they were open to taking me if something changes on the roster. At least that's what they said. But and that happened on a Thursday morning. They sent that. I was supposed to hear back from them by Monday of that week. And Monday of that week, I think around the nighttime, I just started to have this story kind of pop up in my head that I'm not, again, here's another example that I'm not accepted or liked by the gatekeepers or the people who really run the industry. And here's another example why I'm stuck. And that really got my self-esteem down and my feeling toned down. And I didn't realize, but last few weeks days I've been aware of it. Like there's something in the way, because since that point I've noticed kind of a depression at times in the background, and me trying to have to fight it a little bit. And, yesterday I kind of just accepted it, blah, blah, blah. But then listening to you today with Anthony and just what you were just talking about, I really was just in my meditation seeing, that story was having on me, and then trying to let it go and dissolve like Sturgis was talking about. But I guess the point of me bringing this up is, it's funny how we don't realize how stories or thought patterns, if we really start to believe them, how they just start to color everything for days and weeks, and probably a lot longer if you're not.
How about human history?
Human history. And I'm dealing with a lot of the mythology that my own head has created since, I don't know, whatever it was, maybe since after I did Phil Spector, 26, 27, of like, not getting the level of representation or the level of work that I think I'm capable of, or the disappointment or whatever it is.
Well, I'll tell you what it is.
Okay. That's why I came here, Jack.
Thank you. I don't want to be short thrift, but it's the immediacy. You came in a little bit late, but the focus today was just the immediacy of the moment, part of it. The immediacy of the moment is where all of those conflicts come. And depression is an impression taken seriously. It's an opposition. Pressure is created by opposing what we're doing. If we think we're doing something we don't think we're doing, we're going to see everyone else is doing that thing we don't think we should be doing. That's how we pretend to get rid of it. So what do we see? The industry's against you. As though all those hundreds of thousands of people that are involved in that have had on their calendar, Philip. We're going to screw with this guy. Have you got him on? Yep. Okay. Well, it starts next week. Get ready. when in fact it's simply the thought you're having that is both an imposter because it isn't true. So it's an imposition, and impositions taken seriously become depressing because depression always includes a fight. It's always a fight for the maintenance of the thing that's preoccupying our attention to avoid what it is we're doing to create it. Always. Does it seem like it is? No, of course not. Why would we make it seem that way if we wanted to be honest about it? Maintaining a lie requires lying. So what do we say? It's happening to me. What I need is to treat the symptom. I need to feel better. What do? Postpone addressing the problem. What does the problem do? Grow. What happens when we keep treating something like that? We overdose. Problem grows. Feeling better grows. If I'm constantly treating the symptom, I'm going to do things that constantly have me make believe I'm better, when in fact all I'm doing is setting myself up for another major fall to begin to recognize what it is I'm doing. And it's inevitable. People who commit suicide don't get the second chance that we can within the thinking to start noticing, if I'm even doing this and thinking about it and continue, it's going to lead to darker thoughts. And that last thought's going to be the only thing I can control right now is the last thing I should do. So I'm going to go ahead and do just that. And I would say suicide isn't the last thing we should do. It's the thing that should never be done. And yet that's the course. So for our purposes here, and this was largely what Sturgis was chipping at, and Sturgis, I think all of your points are actually on the button. And I do think this is an exercise and it does involve practice. But I think that because I know that I seem to have this defensive, denial, defiant nature that I think is who I am and I still believe is who I am. So in the maintenance of those ideas, I don't even think I'm thinking. I still think I need to practice to overcome them rather than see there's nothing to overcome if I'm actually being honest. So I would say that I continue to lie to any degree that those things seem to need practice, reminding, a new form of addressing. If the absolute knowing nature of my knowing nature has always been there, then I don't have any pathways that have been created in the grooves of my brain or my system that are any greater than that knowing, except to the degree I start creating images of those things and think that my neural pathways and all of that education that I start to apply begins to create forms in my thinking that give me the impression, there's nothing, I just have to, I've did it 900,000 times. I need to do it 900,000 times to correct it. Rather than see that the correction is actually in the recognition that the freedom of every moment allows all possibility to be chosen, which includes those impossible thoughts. And if I'm continuing to choose the impossible thoughts, what am I going to experience? The impossibility of responsibility, for instance. And who am I going to see doing it? Everyone else and everything else. And what am I going to do? Create situations that show that I'm not abundant and I'm scarce and I need more and more and more of something because I'm simply struggling to admit the scarce thinking I'm doing is so scarce not even to exist, except to the opposition I give it. When I start opposing it, I'm thinking there's something to impose. I must think that first thought is real to have any opposition possible. It's a dog chasing its tail. And if you ever notice, whenever they catch it, which is rare, they let it go and start over.
Yeah, you've never seen a dog any animal more disappointed than when they actually catch the tail, right? And they immediately let it go.
Or a Doberman whose tail's been cropped.
Yeah.
But the nature of it is that we've gotten so used to thinking that what's uncommon and unnatural is common and natural, that common sense seems to be the least sense we experience. It isn't common anymore, and it hasn't been common for a long time. We've used the term to mask the fact that it is not common sense to mistake what we're doing as what we shouldn't be doing, to pretend we shouldn't be where we are, to pretend we shouldn't be thinking what we're thinking, when in fact we're always exactly where we are, thinking exactly what we're thinking. And Philip, just to not avoid the issue, because my sense is we create those dramatic issues. Being an actor, you appreciate drama. To give ourselves weight, which is depressing when it's considered real, And the gravity of the situation is, in fact, that seeming thing that even scientists don't understand yet, but seems to pull us toward objects, seems to maintain our presence on this planet, and causes great effort to be spent trying to escape this natural gravitational pull, which rockets and all those sorts of things are designed to do. When I do it in my thinking, I'm giving my thoughts credit that's undue. And as a result, I begin this universe of planets and comets and all kinds of stuff circulating around these thoughts over and over. New thoughts, new thoughts, new thoughts, new thoughts. And I think that's the world I'm actually living in. By actually denying the world I'm in and realizing I can't deny something that's absolute, but I can think I can. And when I do, I start thinking my thinking is so much as to be able to actually be real and true, and replacing reality and truth is an impossibility, since there is no such thing as something. There would be no lack in it to need replacement, or no possibility for that to be possible. So it's just another imagined focus, another way of beating ourselves up, thinking it's somebody else doing it, because we are worth nothing. And the nothing we are worth, and the self we are trying to correct and fix, is a self born of thought that has no basis other than what we think. And to think about something that doesn't exist and then think it's all we are is to chronically think about it as though it's all we need to do, because it depends only on that thought. The impression we create, the depression we create, is dependent on our maintaining the thoughts that we're suffering. That is a pretty sick approach to expressing the totality of our awareness and potential.
Got it. Thanks.
Looking at it isn't easy. If you're seeing what you're seeing and it's accurate, it should be disturbing. Course in Miracles says that very early in the book. And if you're looking at what's disturbing and you're disturbed, you're aligned with it. If you're looking at what's wrong and see it as wrong, you're aligned with it. There's no fight in that. And what's ironic is we never fight with what's right. Why? Because it manifests and is realized in the actions we take. There's a productive result. Why argue with the benefit when all we ever argue with is the scarcity and the demoralization and the discontent and the dissatisfaction and the discomfort and all those things? If the essence is the essence, it is essential to existence, and we are part of and or all of that existence. Not some part of that can be excluded from it, but part of as an included. If any of us disappeared, actually, it would void reality in space, because our reality is not based in our bodies, that are forms, life forms, like all life forms are. They're transitory, transforming constantly. Transformation for us is ultimately dying. Not something to be feared, something to count on and look forward to. It's just part of the process. My sense is what we fear is not death. We fear letting go of the thought about who we are. That's where the anxiety comes from. It's all about ego. Thinking ego is real. Thinking ego can be real. Thinking that even the name has a life of its own that's somehow apart from what we actually think. We've assigned it a name, which starts to give it a form. And in our brain, we start thinking of it as something that actually exists, when all we're doing is giving it shape and articulation and the thing we do in our brain in terms of our imagination. It's like writing a script and then thinking you're the character in it in reality, and never wanting to leave the stage once you finally present the play or the movie. Actors would be imperiled whenever their movie was being shown, because they would die at the end. And that same projection, think about how a projector works. It projects images and light. That's it. It's the same thing we do in our thinking. We project those images and make believe, if they're true, that we need to think about them more to confirm the lack of reality in the thinking that's a lie. So it just becomes an obsession over and over and over and over and over and over. And nothing that comes out of that thinking is going to be productive. It's going to be reactive, impulsive, and compulsive. And it's going to leave a trail of poison, which will accumulate just like we're facing today. It's natural.
I have a question on another subject.
There isn't any other subject.
This girl that I know, she's been sober a month, and she texted me. She said, I'm just things are just terrible, and I'm thinking about having suicidal thoughts. So I said, well, I'd rather see you drink before you kill yourself. And then I didn't really hear back from her a lot, but I've heard that before. Have you guys heard that expression in AA?
What's that? I feel like killing myself?
No. It's better I'd rather see you have a drink than kill yourself. Like, because people get to the point, I've heard, I don't really know. But.
Well, it's the same thing, Anthony. I mean, a drink is
not different. There's not a difference. You said the same thing I did.
Well, the time frame is normally a little different. The immediacy of suicide is pretty final, but the slow death is, again, an attempt to make it look like we're not doing what we're doing. It's the same with sugar and all these other things that we tend to eat, think it's not having any impact because the impact's so seemingly imperceptible, but collectively and over the years, the impact becomes very obvious to a body. So it's the same thing presented in a different way.
I kind of felt bad for saying that.
Are you asking what might have been or might be a way to respond to that that's aligned with this conversation?
Yeah. When I brought it up, I wasn't thinking that. I was just wondering about my comment, but what would you say?
Well, the thought probably isn't the best thought she could be having, and it probably isn't true, and that she's probably struggling with ideas that are not true.
Uh-huh.
The powerlessness of the first step is the admission that the thought we used to have that we could drink and enjoy and control our drinking wasn't true. It's the concession that isn't true, which is why the second half of it is that our lives have become unmanageable. It's to begin to see that the thing we've been managing is a lie.
Yeah.
Why wouldn't our life become unmanageable if we're trying to imagine something that has no basis? We're trying to control something that isn't even to say it's out of control is to give it credit for having been in control.
Here's what she said, actually.
A way to approach that, too, might have been, rather than giving her advice, simply asking why, getting her to talk about that.
Well, here's what she said. She texted me. She said, hey, I'm really not doing well. And to be honest, I'm getting suicidal things got awful. And she said, everything became too much. I'm honestly thinking about buying a tent and living in it somewhere. I just got over being so unhappy and need to heal. I've been sober for over a month and I see how fucked up life truly is.
Yeah. But one of the things that we have learned here, I think, is that as you become aware, seeing things that are wrong become more obvious. It's not new. You're not getting worse. You're actually getting better at seeing what's wrong.
You'll feel better. Doesn't mean.
But the fact that she's feeling bad is probably aligned with the bad thinking she's doing that got her to the point she's sober for a month.
Yeah.
There's a lot of language in the book, too, that you could point to that could relate to that experience, as of course it's the one that most of us have had when we begin to
so I went right into my comment is my comment is before you kill yourself, make sure you take a drink, which I don't, and then she did ... which I don't know what that means, but I didn't like the comment I made, I guess, because I didn't get a response out of it, Well, I was trying to be helpful.
Anthony, there is a part in the book that says, if you think you can control and enjoy your drinking, our hats are off to you.
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
There is no opposition to the idea that we should never consider to have a drink or tell everyone that we need to constantly guard them against it. And you can't get near it. You can't ever have that thought.
Okay.
This conversation, if we were only able to have those positive thoughts, there would be nothing negative to ever consider. And while a knowing nature doesn't have anything negative to consider, it isn't because it's always positive. It's simply because it is. It just is what it is. It isn't positive or negative because it doesn't come from that dimensional.
We're back to that again. It is what it is.
Yeah. But it certainly, while it might provide the possibility for us as humans to implode and self-destruct, the ultimate resource of an infinite source. If you think of the difference between expansion and contraction, when I want to deny something, I start to contract. So what am I doing? I'm going to get down to a single point at some point, which is how they think the universe started. Singularity. But if I expand, I can go on forever, unless there's an obstacle at some point. And if the limits constantly expand, they must be expanding into something that's bigger than the limits, clearly, which would be infinite rather than finite. So it's at least some indication of a direction that we go in growth and learning. And if what I'm doing is repeating an old thought, I'm trying to make that point that I'm smaller than I actually am by getting to that point, that all I want to do is hammer that point in and wonder why I feel like killing myself, because there's nowhere else to go when you finally get to the bottom of a funnel that has no outlet. It's like being in the corner of a room. You think you're hiding, but it's pretty obvious to anyone beyond you that you're standing in the corner. There's nowhere to go. So we can box ourselves in very quickly that way. And that's what this obsessive thinking is trying to kill ourself, because the self that we think is alive has no life. It's actually trying to self-correct by doing what it's doing. But we mistake that by meaning that killing our body and our brain is the answer, rather than say, no, this thing you're doing has no basis. Of course you're obsessed. Of course you're depressed.
How about the fact that if you ask the person, well, tell me what's going on? Why are you feeling so bad? That just brings up the whole reason that things are terrible. That's probably not good to just talk about.
But to Sturgis's point, if she's talking about it, that would seem to be honest to me enough to count on. And say, I'm glad you're talking about it. This isn't something that's unique to you. I would say we all have had suicidal thoughts. And one of them may not be seeing us kill ourselves, but this wish that all that's wrong finally go away once and for all is a death wish, because we're asking to be insensitive and detached from our own awareness, rather than recognize our own sentient nature, helps us see the things that are wrong clearly. It's not designed to avoid it and deny it, until we get into this loop of thinking a lie can be true. Do we create this hodgepodge of rationalization and hypocrisy and insanity that we make believe is normal and true? It's only normal to the thing we're doing to create it, which is abnormal.
Yeah.
So if normal is abnormal, there's a conflict. If normal is normal, no conflict. You can start to see the correctness versus the inaccuracies in just simply looking at a conflict as being evidence that I am opposed to something happening. Somewhere, somehow, right now, there's opposition. There's an opposition force that seems to be real and true enough to have power to be a force at all. And if I'm forced up against a zero, like any number, the number disappears automatically. If I see it as a 1, it confirms the thing I'm doing. The whole system of computers is based on that zeros and ones. That's it. The whole basis of it. It either isn't or it is. It isn't or to be or not to be is the question. If I have questions, I know they're coming from doubt. That's it. Why would I have doubt and questions all the time? Or why would I have questions all the time if I wasn't struggling with doubt? Why would I have doubt if I wasn't struggling with things that weren't true?
I like what you just said there. Why would you have doubt if you're struggling with things that are true?
Well, principles, which was another one of the components of what we started with today when you were here with Gabe early. Principles underline all problems. So as we begin looking in our thinking from an absolute state of mind, recognizing that absolute state of mind is in fact our present awareness, our present knowing awareness, thinking all of a sudden starts saying, I'm off the hook. I don't have to think about what I'm thinking about, what I'm thinking about, what I'm thinking about any more than a horse has to go in circles unless it's on a lead with somebody whipping it to go in circles. All of a sudden it gets quiet between us and there's less to say, there's less to fight for, and a little more contemplation, a little more consideration, a little more recognition, because the actual observable our ability to observe becomes more obvious as we start looking at what we're doing. And you can't see something you're doing. Something you're seeing as what you're doing can't be who you are, because who would be looking at it if it were?
A little more action, a little less conversation.
Well, it's just a difference in making, it's just a difference in defending thoughts, picking up, I can finish saying something and somebody who I've interrupted or interjected will pick up exactly where they left off.
Yeah.
Because they're trying to complete that point. They're trying to maintain. They think if they can finally explain it right, it's going to be gone. And the fact is, if we can finally think in right terms, we'll say things in ways that will eliminate the problem and illuminate immediately other awarenesses. And I suspect we crossed that point together.
Jack, actually, no, but it's been my experience that these gatekeepers have continued to do this despite whatever I think.
Well, because you continue to think that they continue to do it.
Jack, that was a joke on what you just said.
I guess I wasn't in a comedic point.
Sorry.
No. I see what you're saying, because it's basically pointing to the redundancy of making believe that somehow they keep doing it as you think about it. Yeah.
Well, someone who makes a point, who's not really listening, they just keep going until they feel their point is made.
Exactly. You know why they continue to go?
To keep it going.
There's no point. Absolutely no point. Why do they keep trying to make it? If it's made, if it exists, you wouldn't have to make it.
That's funny.
It's the same thing as people who say, you're not listening to me. I'm like, yeah, you're not saying anything. Stories are an attempt to accuse ourselves. We come up with all these historical versions. They're all attempts, not all of them, I'm sorry. The present now has no narrative. It just is what it is. It doesn't have a story attached to it. Some of the stories we tell have principles attached to them. And when I grew up, they used to say the moral of the story is such and such. And, fairy tales, all that stuff had morals. There were points being made about honesty and about truth and about forgiveness and about generosity and all that. You don't hear a lot of that anymore, but you hear lots of stories justifying why people are reactive and hateful and spiteful and contemptful. A lot of them, because they're all based in that. They're all trying to maintain the ideas that aren't true as being true by repeating themselves over and over again. And even in society, it is thought that if you repeat a lie long enough, it becomes truth. How could that possibly be true amongst adults? Amongst adults, please. It's just silly. To look clearly at what we're doing, it becomes silly. To look at it seriously is to think there's something to take. Taking things seriously is to make believe there's something I can get out of it, because the something I'm thinking from is the self I think I am. Rather than conceding, it's absolutely nothing more than delusional. It's a mirage. Nobody in the desert who happened to see conveniently an oasis in the distance with water was seeing it for any other reason that it was the one thing they needed, to be out of the sun and get some water. How convenient. Anybody ever find it? Probably not. Mirages always become mirages the closer you get to exhausting all the energy you have to finally realize it. You can tell immediately by the discontent and the discomfort and the dis-easiness, the conflicts, the opinions, the spitefulness, the ideas of other people and what's wrong with them that seem so clear in us when we know we're struggling with self-doubt and doubt in general. Pretty clear indication something's up in what we're doing, what we're thinking, that has no basis.
Well, thank you, Jack.
Thank you, Philip. I appreciate it. I know that that's been on your plate, and I appreciate you bringing it up and talking about it openly, because I suspect that these ideas we have about things that are difficult to talk about help us think that somehow not talking about them by keeping them in the dark make them better, when in fact they just fester and grow and get moldy.
Yeah. I mean, when I feel like I'm stuck or like things are not moving forward, it's like, I don't know, it
Can I
sucks
give
and I
you
get
a tip?
upset about it.
Can I
And
give
then
you a tip?
I'm like, okay, why is this happening?
If you feel stuck, let me just suggest to you, if truth is true, you're feeling what you're doing in thought accurately. If you feel, why does this keep happening? You're feeling your insistence on making it persist because you keep thinking what you're thinking is going to someday solve the problem. So you wonder why you feel stuck because you're going to assign the blame to everything else. The sick thinking never thinks for itself what it's doing, only your own observe. If you didn't have an ability to see it clearly, there would be nothing but that to experience. Nothing. And the irony is, Philip, if all you could do was think in that same way, you would not feel stuck. And you would not think it just keeps going on. You would think, man, I am fully realized. I am a fully actualized human being doing the only thing I can do. How beautiful. You follow that?
Can you say it again?
If you feel stuck and like something keeps going on and on and on, you're feeling what you're doing in your own thinking. There's nothing more immediate to our experience than what we're doing. How is it that we can address a complete industry of people we don't even know and think they're responsible when in fact we're not admitting the responsibility for what we're actually doing? If you feel stuck, the thought you're having repetitively is stuck in the ideas you have of it being true. If you're feeling that it goes on and on and on, you're trying to give permanence to it by repeating it over and over and over and over again. That's the stuckness, and the seeming impermanence of it continuing to linger is the repetition of it over and over and over and over again. That's all that it is. Now, if you had no way of seeing that clearly, you would feel fulfilled by that and feel at ease by that. But the fact that you're not and see it as a problem would suggest to me, and I would suggest to you, is a knowing capacity that is greater than everything you've ever thought. That awareness allows you the clarity. That backdrop of clarity allows you to see that there's dust on the lens. Mm-hmm. That you're not blind because your fingers are in your eyes. Your fingers are in your eyes, and your eyes are seeing clearly that they can't see beyond your finger or your eyelid.
Yeah.
Just beginning to actually address it accurately. If we're doing the thing we're doing and it's sick, we're going to think we're not doing it, so everyone else is going to look like the culprit. That's a clue.
Yeah.
How could we be so good at knowing what's wrong with them when we don't seem to be very good at the immediacy of recognizing what's wrong in what we're thinking? It's not possible. I mean, it may be possible, but I would say that's another idea that doesn't seem logical or rational within the construct of thinking, because it would once more rely on something that, even if it were possible, the odds are so slim, it's improbable. So the chance for us to see so clearly in what's wrong with everybody else is doubtful, I would say, for good reason. And again, why we suffer doubt and uncertainty. It's a clear indication that we know better. Those are our body language. And to think that they're foreign languages that we can't read is to dismiss them is illegible, unreasonable, illogical, preposterous. They're not. They're perfectly clear. The turnaround is starting to look at them accurately and say, wow, could it be that all this time I've always thought everything but what I was thinking was responsible? And if you begin to concede that maybe it is, without even agreeing with it or believing in it or trusting it or having faith in it, you might start to notice that just the window being opened starts to bring some fresh air into the thinking that doesn't seem so dramatic. And you start saying, well, how else? This is intuition, where you start saying, what could possibly affect me more than the thing going on inside the head that affects me, that causes the greatest effect? If I didn't have a brain, I wouldn't be affected by anything. And if I was, I certainly wouldn't be aware of it. I just, like a leaf. It doesn't cry out in pain. It just it dissolves when it falls from a tree and drops. It doesn't crash land. And Just does what it does, doesn't think about it, just knows what to do. If it's decomposing, the composition of its position is basically being taken apart. What is it? It's always been made of that essence. It was never anything else, just like our bodies. So if you see the immediacy of the moment as immediate and start to see that what you're doing in the immediacy of the present moment, now, is what's having the greatest impact on you, the stories in the past and future will start to disappear in terms of a reliance that you've used chronically to make believe somehow or another it's something other than your experience that's impacting you. And then you can begin to have an incredibly productive, dynamic impact because you become aligned with all that other potential that's out there, all of it, rather than become a disinterested party who feels disconnected and kind of limping along, what's wrong with me? And that goes for all of us. Principles do not apply to one if they don't apply to all. And if they don't apply to all, they aren't principled. 12th step is about practicing principles in all our affairs. I don't think Bill suggested that to make a torture test for us to constantly fail at. I think he saw delusion. I think when he said, let go of old ideas, absolutely. The end of the 6th step in the 12 and 12, it says, here is where we began to abandon limited objectives. Abandon. He didn't say reduce, refine, develop a new set. He said abandon, completely abandon ourself in another section. Why would that be the case if there was any value there in the self? It's all delusion. It's self-centered ideas centered on a self that's only what we think, period. And in facing that, as you pointed out, Sturgis, you know, that Katie reminded me too, that same the same week I had that experience, my sister died, drank herself to death. My baby sister, the 4th in the family. And clearly being confronted with death is a good chance to begin to realize the seeming focus on life being connected to ideas I have about who I think I am. And I think that obviously helped enhance my whole experience in that moment, because there's a certain impossibility to imagine somebody you've always known to be gone and disappear in the way that physicality disappears. And yet also recognize that there seems to be my experience in death and people who have died, including my mother at 15, was that I had a greater sense of her than when she was alive. It was much more expansive, much more inclusive, much more generous, much more loving, much more caring, not just out of the shame and guilt I had for all the things I did wrong and felt regretful for, but just a renewed awareness that she was in perfect order, that the things she struggled with and the disease that she had that killed her body. It did not reduce that spirit that I knew, that I was aware of, that I shared with, and that I literally lived in, that body that I lived in with her and whatever that spirit was. And as dramatic as it was, and as long as it took for me to confront the mourning and the grief and all that, which was about 11 years for me, and when I did and began to witness the grief I had in the morning and started to cry and let that go and express itself through my body, I had 8 bowel movements the next day, literally 8 full-on bowel movements. And I was in therapy for the first time, and I said to the doctor, I said, now I know what being full of shit is. Because my body, the constriction, the anxiety and the stress and the tension that had been created had allowed it to dysfunction in equal measure to that stress that I was creating by thinking things are better. And it wasn't just hoping things were better. I just didn't know how to comprehend this fact of life, this seeming fact of life that bodies die and decay, and hadn't really witnessed the fulfillment of actually this other awareness that confirmed life, didn't actually take it away. And part of that is also beginning to recognize as a tribute to those who do die during our experience of them, is that the grief and the shame and the mourning are all tributes to our value of them, our valuation of them, and our consideration of them, and our knowing of them, because they really reflect all the defective natures of my inability to have communicated an absolute nature of love with them while they were here. And I went to a funeral once and came late and couldn't see the people. So I thought I was in the wrong room because they were talking so glowingly about this guy that I knew was a pretty notorious rascal, to say the least. And it kind of snapped in my head that when people's behaviors disappear because I'm so buried in the idea, or seem to be so buried in the idea that who I am is what I think, then my behaviors become all I am. So all those idiosyncrasies I see that are wrong in others are really my own revelation of all the stupid things I'm doing within the name of self, right? As those disappear, people are all of a sudden seen in their essence rather than in the idiosyncrasies and the traits that we tend to perpetuate through our existence. And part of my curiosity is, and it's really not as curious as it is acknowledging, that we seem to be perfectly clear about this absolute knowing when we're at points absolutely near death. Because people consistently in either near-death experiences or people who die and come back have these absolute clarifying experiences. And I would say any kind of fear we've ever faced has that sort of clarification in it, like real threats to our body. Car coming at us, or being hit by a car severely, or being chased by a bear. There's a clarity of knowing that comes. But why is it that we would squander that only for the moments of extreme threat, rather than realize that that little bit we're doing every day to diminish our sentient capacity is doing the exact same thing by making believe the only threat we are creating, or the only threat that we're facing, the greatest threat that we're facing, is the one that we're creating? Why do we need to create that threat to get to a point where we're willing to face the absolute nature of our being by doing the things that actually start to kill the body to have the experience? Why do we wait? That's pretty sick.
Hey, let me ask you a quick question. How did Freud come up with the id? What is the id and the suit? How did he think of all these things, and what are they? And what are they based on? Id, super id, the ego, what?
I think there are ways of giving them more and more and more identification and form to make believe they're real. And I think that's one of the problems today in thinking.
What's the difference between an id and an ego? Do you know? I mean, is it something?
Look it up. Yes, I do. But I'm not going to get into that. I'm not going to develop that conversation, but look at it. We can talk about it next week. My sense is it's a form of trying to rationalize having a self that doesn't exist.
Yeah.
It's trying to come up with ways to think that one's does performance and the other one does this reactive thing. The other one is beyond it. And it's all of a sudden giving self this other sense.
Yeah.
So,
and I thought something you said earlier was interesting about the subconscious. We talk about this subconscious. We don't know it's in. But how about a dream? How does that work? Your mind, now that really is bizarre when you really think about it. You're sleeping and your mind is creating a story, a movie about something that didn't happen.
Well, let me pose something even more curious, Anthony. You're awake, dreaming. You're asleep. The ideas you have, dreaming, you're awake.
Yeah, it's still doing the same thing I'm doing during the day, but I'm
exactly.
Sleeping. Yeah,
exactly.
Okay.
So the question is, why do we put ourselves to sleep with ideas that we preoccupy ourselves with to become numb to our actual full experience? If we didn't think those ideas and those realities, the dream was true and real. Simply because we can project a dream or a projection of images doesn't make what we create true and real. It makes what we create a story, a narrative, a script, probably not unlike the scripts we get from the pharmacy, the prescriptions. We call them scripts to feel better. We're trying to
that one was for you, Jackie. Hey, yeah, that's really interesting. And then also, if you have a car and you realize, hey, if every time this car comes to a stoplight, it saves gas by turning it off and then restarting when the lights start. So we can figure that out. We understand we don't understand the brain at all, even though we've had so much time to look at it. And somehow at night, it needs to turn off. It cannot work on just 24/7. It has to shut down. And we don't know how it does it, right? Or what's going on. And
they think there is studies that think that when we're sleeping, the brain washes out all the information that we don't need to keep, which is why our memories tend to be selective and isolated. We can have very clear images of something and forget a lot of the surrounding issues because the brain goes through a processing. Like there's only so much room it has. There's only so many terabytes it has.
Yeah. But isn't that interesting though? Just on a purely mathematical science based, like we can put together cars, rockets, nuclear science, but we can't figure out this thing that we have.
You know why? Because thinking of itself is myopic and seems to be an impossibility to have any clarity when in fact we don't see the mind from thinking. We see the mind from an observatory capacity of knowing.
Uh-huh.
And if we didn't have that capacity, thinking about thinking would be all we could do.
But I'm just talking purely science. It's pretty incredible. So whatever it is, it's like this thing, we've had it for a while to study and nobody can figure it out. We shouldn't talk about it and what it does.
We're thinking of it from thinking, Anthony.
Yeah.
Which has us think it's mysterious.
Well, we do that when we look at rocket ships. We think of it as thinking, right?
But it's outside of our brain.
Uh-huh.
The immediacy, the experience we're creating by thinking about our thinking is immediate to our entire experience. It's not some part and piece out there somewhere. That's why we seem to see clearly what's wrong in others, because we have perspective for a moment to look at what we're actually thinking, because the lens of which we're seeing through is clouded with the thoughts we have.
So somebody that always is negative and sees terrible things in others, they're just a terrible person. Usually, like that's all if they're happy and got it together.
Not that they're a terrible person any more than you're an idiot when you think idiotic thoughts. Thinking idiotic thoughts is pretty common.
But it goes without saying, though, if somebody's really criticized, like they hate this and they're not happy with it, they're just not a happy person, right?
If it goes without saying, why are you saying it?
Because I'm just wanting to make sure we're calibrating is what I'm doing. I want to make sure we're on the same understanding that if there's not somebody that's...
Anthony, you're talking about somebody else rather than you, first of all. And secondly, if what you see so clearly they're doing, you must be doing to see it all.
Yeah, I'm thinking if you can calibrate yourself. Don't you calibrate using other things? You don't really calibrate. Let me calibrate yourself.
Well, I think that's what Sturgis was talking about, was a calibration or a recalibration.
And I like how you answered Sturgis' question, because he was looking for a way of calling what we were doing, and you called it witnessing it or verification instead of something else. You were saying confirming. We were confirming that we're having those bad thoughts. Yeah. We're not practicing a new way of thinking. We're just confirming what we're seeing.
But Sturgis,
yes,
to the degree that we continue to maintain the wrong thought, we're trying to give it permanence in reinforcement. Think of the word. We're using force, meaning we're opposing it in somehow, we're suppressing it in somehow, we're creating an opposition force to think that somehow redoing it over and over again creates permanence, when what it does is create a permanent thinking. It creates a chronic obsessive thought about something to be maintained, and we probably have 1,000 of those going on in our system at any given moment. Maybe more. I don't know. I don't know what the math is. And again, to talk about it in that way gives it a sense of form that may or may not be. But my suspicion is all of the bodily memories get stored. And so as we look closely and carefully or clearly, it starts to actually reveal that we've been storing these ideas, thinking of somehow it's not having an impact, while stress and tension and anxiety in our body are undermining all of our bodily systems.
Yeah, well, I mean, there's a beautiful rabbit hole there, but not only is there a ton of scientific evidence that it gets stored, but not only does it get stored on a cellular level, at least, during our own lifetimes from birth, but this is DNA, this is generational. Yes. That this stuff gets stored,
which is probably why we have more and more allergies, which are abnormal responses, because we have consistently perpetuated an impact on a body that's designed to develop and adapt to the influences it experiences. And when those influences are undue, it creates maladaptive behaviors and consequences to things that we can no longer tolerate.
And we used to be in
the I also think it's important, or it's helpful and hopeful to me to note that that storing, quote unquote, is really a blueprint, right? Much like the sort of genes that we suspect may make us more conducive to alcoholism than not. But, the blueprint means it's in there, but it's really a light layer that needs triggering in order to actually become something that affects us on a biological level.
Well, but I would suspect that we cause the triggers quickly to confirm the problem of
Yes.
seeing something happening to us. And there again is an innate
Yes.
sense of knowing to even do that.
Yes.
So
Yes.
another aspect of it, Sturgis, which I think is overlooked a lot, and I don't want to, having seen it, I don't want to be quiet about it again, but I think we've talked about it today, is that if the unnatural thing needs to be constantly done to maintain and reinforce the thing that isn't right, real, or true, that doesn't really exist other than in the constant thinking about it. If that's the unnatural thing, and we just begin to concede that knowing isn't that thing, that knowing is in fact perfectly intact while we are doing that thing with our thinking, while we are misusing our thinking, it doesn't really obstruct a knowing nature. It just simply preoccupies our attention with a thinking nature that thinks it knows, when in fact it's struggling with what it knows because it's constantly wondering what the hell it's doing.
Yeah.
Right. And that you can see the kind of conflict that we create in the thinking, which again allows thinking to be thinking rather than knowing. If we think of thinking as something that doesn't know and knowing is something that doesn't think, and only think of them not as separate because they're intimately connected. One is the possibility of the other, and the other is what provides the possibility. One is the possibility of the other, and the other is the possibility that allows that infinite expression to be possible. So they aren't different, but if you think of them differently, you start to see that the knowing sense we have is not our brain. Our brain is a calculator. It's constantly analyzing, constantly rotating, constantly coming up with new experiences because it's constantly seeing new things. And that information is coming in. Always, always, always. Our senses are feeding it raw data. What we think about our senses is what we're struggling with, not what our senses tell us, because our senses just tell us what's happening. They're aligned with it naturally. But if nature is nature, and we begin to reveal to nature what's natural, nature is going to heal. Our brain is going to heal a lot quicker than it took to create the pathways we think we need to keep manifesting and maintaining to reinforce the idea that they're so deep they'll never become undone.
Yeah. And so what you're saying is,
that's a friend of mine's daughter studying for a PhD up at Stanford in oceanography.
Yeah.
And she said that what BP did in the Gulf killed more of the plants than the oil would have had it just been let go, because nature tends to heal itself. What they did was give the appearance they were doing something so they could say they were doing something, and ended up killing off coral reefs and all kinds of stuff as a byproduct of trying to get where the oil just naturally congeals and can be picked up on the beach. And not to suggest there wasn't something that could have been done, but generally speaking, when we use thinking to look like we're doing something rather than do something, we end up creating appearances that aren't really substantive. They just appear to be that way, and the consequences of it are what we're collectively and aggregately experiencing today, and always have. The sum total of the moment is everything that's ever happened in terms of our physical experience or human experience.
And so what you're saying is that when life gives you lemons, give those lemons back. Why were those lemons free? Is there something wrong with the lemons? Are the lemons haunted? Be suspicious of the lemons.
Well, I hardly think that's what I was getting at, but I appreciate your creative capacity to develop a new angle. If nature is nature and it's left to be nature and seen as natural, then our nature is essential, and essence would be that nature. And that essence is absolute. That essence, if there is anything limited, my question was, what would it be limited by? If not something infinite. If something is finite, the only thing that could allow it to be finite would be something, it would be a concept within an infinite source to consider it limited, and then all it becomes is a consideration rather than reality or truth. And if my body can get worse over time, my body can get better immediately. by thinking clearly and allowing that obstruction to be noticed by that white light, that absolute light that has no shadow in it, has no matter in it, because it isn't obstructed, would probably be a very powerful healing source, because it would actually reflect power rather than imagined power and imagined force, an imagined source.
So then shouldn't be very many things you're angry at, right? After going to this course a lot, you shouldn't really get angry at something, because you would just
not about doing what you're doing, Anthony. It's not about not doing what you're doing. It's about noticing that when you're angry, you're probably frustrated with what you're doing.
But there's not a lot of time to really get angry. Like, I notice myself, I'm not really getting angry. I don't watch a movie and go, God, I'm so angry watching this movie.
Well, that doesn't mean you won't be, and it doesn't mean it's not possible.
Yeah.
If everything that's possible is possible, it's possible for us to do the absolute worst thing. Absolutely possible.
Yeah, I don't want to get off track. All of a sudden, then I'm angry. I'm like, what's going on here?
The freedom of recognizing accurately what's happening is recognizing you have absolutely no requirement to do that thing.
Okay.
That's the freedom from addiction. That's
and again, I want to manage it again. I'm like, okay, so it's like you don't have to have a man. It's fine. That's what I need. Something I don't have to manage.
But Anthony, you're starting to see with a little more clarity the expansiveness, to be noticing the opposites, to be noticing that clarity, to be noticing the struggle, to be noticing the management style. You're starting to see how we've been using what we thought was fixing it to actually maintain it. You know what a good manager does?
Lets them do what they do best.
Maintain a building. They try to maintain the success of whatever they're managing. If we've been maintaining the success of imagining things that aren't true, we're masters at feeling like we're slaves to that thing. It's a self-induced, self-imposed, self-propelled awareness.
Yeah.
It's only in thought awareness, which is a thoughtless awareness.
Yeah.
So I love you guys. Sturgis, I'm really glad to see you.
You too.
And I want to, you have a very scientific understanding and academic history, and especially with technology and all that
but
stuff.
You're on record still.
Which I don't have. And I appreciate the information, because some of it has been seen as being so true as to be true and real in relation to truth and reality, as though it could be, rather than simply thoughts that have accumulated that are probably accurate about what's happening in our physicality. But I don't think we've yet experienced the healing nature that is possible. And so we don't have the evidence to actually point to anything other than the decrepit nature of this constant critical or chronic thinking that we've been doing for eons, or however long we've been doing it, and making believe that it's truth and reality.
Yeah.
And there's probably a lot of accuracy to a lot of it, but it doesn't make it true enough to be intractable, when in fact, if you turn the light on in any dark room, the darkness never survives. So enlightenment by its nature is beginning to just sit and say, could it be as simple as my thinking I don't know better? And could it be as simple as recognizing that when I'm in doubt, I'm asking questions about something that are doubtful? Why would we be asking questions? There's no question in an absolute knowing state of being. There's no doubt either.
Yeah. Well, what I think is cool, at least that I noticed, to your point, is that, on the edges of, and I think the front edges, like meaning the edge that is sort of moving forward, of each of these respective, channels of thought, right? Or work, the science of epigenetics, the sort of, the movement of New Age, and, even the sort of work of philosophy, like the edges, the front edges of all of these, channels, seem to be going in the right direction, despite the friction, that they're encountering. It's challenging, but it's hopeful too.
I would say
we're having similar conversations across all these channels in another way.
given the absolute nature of nature, it's all perfect. There's nothing
Yeah,
wrong
well, I
with
mean,
it
that would,
because it's
yeah,
all
that
perfectly
tracks, right?
correctable.
That tracks.
It's all perfectly correctable. And yet we continue to do the incorrect thing to try and prove how much more it's correctable.
Yeah.
We're trying to make it worse to make believe it's impossible rather than start to see that it's absolutely possible. We're just not thinking it's possible.
Yeah.
And
yeah.
collectively, to promote those ideas comes in all those hidden ideas about all those little bits and pieces that we think are so accurate, when in fact, they're probably good observations within the observations, but not necessarily in an absolute way.
Yeah. It's true.
So if there's consideration and curiosity, we're exploring and looking, and at least looking for what we might not think we're seeing.
Yeah.
Very big difference from defending these ideas and thinking it's only limited to what we think and then constantly honing new ways of doing that. That's exactly what the body assimilates in terms of that seeming rigidity, which would be tension, and inflexibility, which would throw backs out and cause all kinds of other ailments. It's assimilating that on our behalf because it's giving us an accurate reflection of what we're thinking and saying, you want a bad back, I'll give it to you. You got it.
Yeah. Yeah.
Not an opinion. It's just a reflection. It's like standing in front of a mirror like you're hobbled. What's the mirror going to do? Look like you're standing up straight? No.
Hey, I got a lot out of this meeting. I was just recapping in my head. And then it's funny as the next thought went through my head is, God, I wish I would have got more out of it though. I'm like, okay, that's funny. That's an opposite idea of everything always, because we covered so much stuff. But I thought, God, I wish it would have been great to get more though.
So Anthony, I'll help you transition a little bit there. When you think you got more out of it, begin to recognize that there's more to everything that you think.
Wait,
Period.
No, I said I wish I could have got more.
I got it. But when you're thinking about what you can get, begin to think that there is more of everything than you can think. Already. Now, already, all that you're struggling from is your limited thinking. That's why you want more. You're using the words, but condemning yourself to it rather than saying, "Oh, this is an accurate assessment of my limited thinking." Of course, I know there's more.
Yeah,
there can be no more in an infinite state because there is no more or less. There is no lesser. There is no greater or lesser in something that's infinite. It's not a spatially bound thing. Beginning to see that all of the thinking we do is designed to help us function in this world that we're in this physical plane that we seem to be in. And that's our body that we're talking about. We don't utilize our body well when the primary nature of its existence is denied.
But you were asking earlier, kind of questioning, why does the body do it? Like, what is the purpose when it's supposed to be running better? It wants to live.
Exactly. I know exactly why it's doing it. Because
it's scared of death.
It's just, no, it thinks, when I make believe that what I think is true and real, I begin to believe who I am is what I think. And that thinking needs to be maintained. And I know someday it won't be. And I'm afraid of that end. The end of my thinking is what I'm afraid of, not the being presence of my nature. And by the way, the other thing about the cars starting and stopping, the one thing I don't think has been looked at, how long do you think those starters are going to last? When a car starts and stops 50 times more than normal. Starters go out. Most of that technology hasn't been around long enough to actually perfect the starter. That's going to be the next thing that stops.
Hey,
the starter's going to burn out.
The starter's going to stop.
Yeah, exactly. I love you guys. Thank you very much for coming and participating. Sturgis, it was really good to see you. I love the thoughts that you bring, and also being able to challenge it openly in terms of standing in the face of things I think I know and may know, but suggesting that some of that lands because they are also things you absolutely know and maybe, like me, haven't come to terms with the thinking, introducing thinking to it sufficiently, where we allow the thinking to follow, so we try to take its lead instead.
Well, I'm grateful for all of it, Jack. Thank you. Love you.
Love you too.
See ya.
Bye, guys.
Campus.